Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the shadowy, cobblestone streets of Colonial London, where the night was more dangerous than the day, and the only thing between you and complete darkness was a flickering lantern carried by a sleepy watchman. You probably wouldn't survive 5 minutes in those streets without tripping over a cartwheel, slipping into an open sewer, or being robbed blind before you even had time to shout for help. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're here, post your location and local time in the comments. I'd love to know where and when you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. London in the 17th and 18th centuries was a city that never truly slept, though it was not alive in the bustling, neon-lit way we think of cities today. Once the sun set, much of the city was consumed by gloom. Oil lamps were scarce and candles were costly, so darkness was the default. Houses might have a faint glow peeking through shuttered windows, but the streets themselves, muddy, narrow, and cluttered, were often left in near pitch blackness. In that setting, the city's night watchmen emerged, carrying lanterns that burned weakly against the vast darkness, patrolling their assigned wards, and trying, in their own sleepy way, to keep order. The role of the watchman was, in many ways, older than colonial London itself. By the early modern period, the idea of policing had not yet taken shape as we know it today. Instead, security was a patchwork of duties distributed among local residents, parish officials, and these hired watchmen. The origins lay in medieval practices of community watch, where neighbours took turns guarding the streets. But by the 17th century, London had grown so vast that rotating citizen duty was no longer practical. So, parishes began hiring permanent night watchmen, men who carried lanterns, staves, and occasionally bells to mark the hours of the night. Their appearance was distinctive enough that they became almost symbols of the era. Watchmen wore heavy cloaks in winter and broad-brimmed hats to protect against rain. Many carried halberds or long staffs, not because they expected to fend off attackers with them, but because the staff signaled authority, a visible marker that they were on duty. The lantern, however, was the most essential tool. It was not just a means of light, but a requirement enforced by law. Lantern laws, as they came to be known, mandated that streets be lit at night, and watchmen were tasked with ensuring compliance. The lantern laws themselves had a curious history. The first significant lantern law in London was enacted in 1417, when Henry V ordered that all households in certain districts hang lanterns outside their doors during the winter months. The idea was simple. Collective lighting would make streets safer, both from crime and from accidents. But compliance was uneven, and by the colonial period, the responsibility often fell to the watch to enforce it. Watchmen would pace the streets not only to deter mischief, but also to knock on doors and remind, or scold, residents to keep their lanterns burning. Imagine, for a moment, the nightly routine of a watchman. As the bells of St. Paul's told the evening hour, he would step out into the night, lantern swinging from a pole. His territory might be only a few blocks long, but those blocks could be treacherous. Cobbles were uneven, refuse was often tossed directly into the street, and puddles of waste water collected in dips in the road. Rats scurried between shadows, and dogs barked at every movement. The watchman moved slowly, calling the hours as he went. 10 o'clock. And all's well. It was both a reassurance and a ritual, a rhythmic way of marking time through the long night. But not everyone found them reassuring. To some Londoners, watchmen were a nuisance. Too sleepy to prevent crime, too noisy to allow proper rest. There were complaints that watchmen often dozed at their posts, huddled in doorways against the cold. Satirical poems of the period poked fun at their tendency to lean on their staffs and nap, letting thieves slip by unnoticed. Indeed, one popular jibe was that watchmen served more as markers of time than as enforcers of law, reliable in calling out the hours, less reliable in catching pickpockets. Yet, they played an indispensable role in enforcing lantern laws. A watchman might stop a resident whose lantern had gone out, knocking gently, or not so gently, on the door, demanding that the light be rekindled. The rule was more than symbolic. A darkened street was considered a public hazard, and households could be fined for failing to keep a lamp burning. It is easy to imagine the irritation of a wary shopkeeper, roused from his bed because his candle had sputtered out. But such were the rhythms of life in colonial London, small acts of compliance that shaped the safety of the community. What made these lanterns so essential was the quality of light itself. Lanterns were usually fueled by oil, often whale oil in wealthier districts, cheaper animal fats elsewhere. The flame was weak, flickering, and prone to blowing out in the wind. Glass panes helped, but soot collected quickly, and the lanterns needed constant tending. The glow illuminated only a small radius, leaving much of the street still in shadows. For travelers, it was often enough just to see the faint flicker of a watchman's lantern down the road, a promise of at least some visibility. For criminals, of course, those same lanterns marked the approach of authority, however bumbling. The presence of lantern laws and watchmen reflected a deeper truth about urban life in this era. The night was a realm of anxiety. Unlike the day, when commerce bustled and crowds offered safety in numbers, nighttime meant vulnerability. Fires were a constant threat, and without ready access to water pumps or organized fire brigades, a blaze could destroy entire streets. Accidents were equally dangerous, as a misstep into an open sewer or collision with a cart could prove fatal. Then there was the fear of crime. Highwaymen and cutpurses thrived in the darkness, and though watchmen were mocked, their very presence provided a kind of psychological bulwark against fear. Of course, enforcing lantern laws was not simply about safety. It was also about order, discipline, and the visibility of authority. A lit street represented not just illumination, but the reach of governance into daily life. Keeping lanterns burning was a reminder that the city's watchful eye extended even into the shadows. In this sense, the watchman with his lantern was both a practical guide through the dark and a symbolic figure of law itself. As London grew through the 17th and 18th centuries, debates about the effectiveness of watchmen intensified. Pamphleteers argued that the system was outdated, that sleepy old men with dim lanterns were no match for organized criminals. Reformers called for more centralized, professional policing. Yet, despite the criticism, the watch persisted, their lanterns swinging through the fog and rain, a stubborn feature of the city's nightly rhythm. When you picture these watchmen trudging their beats, you might be tempted to smile at the quaintness of it all. Men calling the hours, scolding residents for extinguished lanterns, fumbling through pockets for a flint to relight a wick. But beneath the quaintness lay a very real struggle to bring order to an unruly city, to light a path through darkness with whatever tools were at hand. And perhaps the most curious part is how such small acts, hanging a lantern, tending a wick, could become matters of law, enforced with fines and patrols, shaping the way Londoners lived their nights. But if these watchmen were so important to nightly order, how exactly did they come to be chosen? And what kind of men were they really? Guardians of the peace, or simply the city's sleepiest employees? In the popular imagination, a watchman might look like a stalwart figure, a tall, broad-shouldered guardian with a booming voice and sharp eyes, braving the dangers of the night to keep others safe. But the reality was that many watchmen were elderly, often well past their physical prime. Parish records from the late 17th century describe men in their 50s, 60s, even 70s hired to carry out the nightly watch. They were often chosen not because of their skill or vigor, but because they were available, inexpensive, and sometimes because they could not find work elsewhere. For poorer parishes, employing the young and able-bodied would have cost more than they could afford. Wealthier men, meanwhile, could often pay fines or hire substitutes to avoid serving. The result was a watch force dominated by men who had already lived long lives of labor and now eked out an income through this nightly duty. Some were former soldiers, their bodies bearing the marks of past campaigns. Others had worked as porters, craftsmen, or tradesmen until age and infirmity slowed them down. The watch gave them a livelihood, meager but steady. The pay itself was far from generous. In the early 1700s, A night watchman might earn sixpence a night, sometimes supplemented by tips or Christmas boxes, from grateful residents. The hours were long, stretching from 9 in the evening until sunrise, and the work was monotonous walking, calling the hours, checking doors, watching for fire, and enforcing the lantern laws. The physical strain of staying awake through the night, especially in winter cold, was considerable. Many men leaned on their staves for support, dozing lightly between calls, roused only when their rounds demanded it. The calling of the hours was perhaps their most iconic duty. At regular intervals, a watchman would stop, raise his voice, and announce the time. Past 1 o'clock and a cloudy morning, or 2 o'clock and all's well. These cries served several purposes. They reassured residents who lay in bed, listening for signs that order prevailed outside. They also helped coordinate the rounds of watchmen, ensuring they could gauge each other's presence across streets and alleys. For some Londoners, the calls became a kind of nocturnal clock, a way to measure the passing of restless nights. But not everyone appreciated this. Diaries and letters from the period are full of complaints about noisy watchmen disturbing sleep. One irritated resident described them as blasting trumpets of the night, who woke more households than they reassured. Satirical pamphlets mocked their repetitive chants, portraying them as half-asleep men who barely noticed when a crime occurred right under their noses. And yet, there were moments when the watch proved crucial. Fires, for instance, were one of the greatest fears of urban life. A watchman making his rounds with a lantern might spot smoke rising from a chimney gone wrong, or smell burning in an alley. His cries would rouse neighbors, and buckets would be passed from hand to hand in a desperate attempt to contain the blaze before it consumed entire rows of houses. In those moments, the lantern was not just a tool of order, but a potential lifesaver. The watch also played an important role in enforcing the curfew, like regulations that governed the city. Certain trades were forbidden from operating after dark, and taverns could be fined if patrons lingered too long into the night. Watchmen, armed with their staves and lanterns, might shuffle into a noisy alehouse, demanding patrons disperse. They were not always effective enforcers. Patrons sometimes jeered or mocked them. But their presence was enough to remind Londoners that nighttime was meant for rest, not revelry. Then, of course, there were the lantern laws themselves. By the 18th century, London's regulations required that during the darker months of the year, households display lanterns at specific hours. A watchman patrolling his ward was expected to notice if a street fell into darkness, and to knock on doors to demand that lamps be relit. Some records note fines levied against households for negligence, though in practice many watchmen preferred a gentler approach, knocking, waking, and grumbling rather than writing a ticket. The lantern laws, however, were not universally popular. For poorer families, the cost of oil or candles was a significant burden. Keeping a lamp burning for several hours each night meant sacrificing fuel that could otherwise be used for cooking or warmth. There were frequent complaints that the laws disproportionately burdened the poor, while wealthier households complied more easily. Some even argued that the dim lanterns did little to deter crime and were simply an unnecessary expense. Watchmen were thus caught in the middle, enforcing laws that many resented, while themselves often poor men reliant on the wages the system provided. Their lanterns marked them as figures of authority, but also made them targets for ridicule. Plays and ballads of the period often lampooned the watchman as a bumbling figure, more likely to fall asleep in a doorway than to chase down a thief. Still, the watch was not entirely without power. They could detain those caught breaking the peace, at least until the morning when a constable or magistrate might deal with the matter. Drunken brawlers, unruly apprentices, or suspicious strangers found loitering in alleys could be taken into custody. Watch houses, small shelters scattered across the city, served as temporary holding places where both watchmen and detainees might pass the long hours of the night. Some of these watch houses were little more than wooden shacks with benches, dimly lit by a single candle. Life inside a watch house could be surprisingly social. Watchmen often gathered there between rounds, warming themselves by a fire, sharing food, or even nodding off together in exhausted heaps. Local gossips and tradesmen sometimes dropped by, turning the watch house into an informal hub of nighttime chatter. For many watchmen, the companionship of the watch house was the only thing that made the long, cold hours bearable. Despite their flaws, watchmen became woven into the rhythm of city life. Children grew accustomed to their cries marking the hours. Merchants relied on them to spot fires or disturbances. Households grudgingly relit lamps at their knocking. In an age before professional policing, before gaslights, and before modern infrastructure, these men with their lanterns were what stood between order and chaos at night. And yet, as London modernized, pressure grew to replace the old watch system with something more efficient. Critics pointed to rising crime in the 18th century, arguing that sleepy old men with lanterns could not possibly deter organized gangs. Pamphlets circulated calling for reform, for centralized policing, for brighter street lighting. The lantern laws themselves began to seem archaic as new technologies, oil lamps on posts, and eventually gaslights, promised more reliable illumination. But before the watch could be swept away by reform, it lingered, clinging stubbornly to the nightly rounds. One could still hear the familiar cries of 3 o'clock and a fine frosty morning, echoing down cobbled lanes. The lanterns still flickered, weak against the fog, carried by men who had been walking the same streets for decades. So the question arises, in a city growing rapidly toward modern policing and lighting, how long could the watchmen, with their lanterns and their laws, hold on before being replaced entirely? By the time the 18th century began to lean toward its latter half, the future of London's watchmen and their lantern laws was already being quietly debated in coffee houses, pamphlets, and in the chambers of Parliament. The sleepy men with their dim lights had done their duty for centuries, but the city was outgrowing them. London was no longer the relatively compact settlement of medieval times. Its population had ballooned to nearly 1 million by the mid-1700s, making it one of the largest cities in Europe. The challenges of crime, fire, and nighttime order had grown alongside it. The watch system, once adequate for a small medieval borough, now looked increasingly outdated. The criticisms were loud, often mocking, but not entirely unfounded. Newspapers and satirical prints showed images of watchmen slumped against walls, snoring beneath their broad-brimmed hats while thieves crept by with purses and poultry in hand. Court records revealed stories of watchmen being overpowered by drunken gangs of apprentices, or bribed with a mug of ale to look the other way. The familiar chant of "past midnight, and all's well" began to feel less like reassurance and more like irony when robberies were taking place just streets away. And yet, despite their shortcomings, the lantern-bearing watchmen persisted. They endured not because they were the most effective system, but because they represented continuity, tradition, and local authority. Each parish had its own watch, and each community took a certain pride in its own men, however sleepy or bumbling they might appear. The lantern laws, too, symbolized something greater than mere lighting. They embodied the idea that the city could regulate its own order, that even in darkness there were rules to follow. But reform was inevitable. The 18th century was a time of great change in how people thought about governance, infrastructure, and public safety. Enlightenment thinkers began to argue that order required rational planning, centralized control, and professional institutions. Why should the safety of London's streets be left to chance, enforced by men too old or tired to resist crime? Why not instead employ younger, trained men, supervised by a central authority and equipped with better tools? The first major challenge to the lantern laws came not from the watchmen themselves, but from technology. By the early 1800s, oil lamps mounted on posts were appearing in greater numbers across London. These provided steadier light than household lanterns and removed the burden from individual residents. Soon after, gaslight arrived, revolutionizing urban illumination. Whole streets could now be bathed in light from a single supply, making the old system of knocking on doors to rekindle lanterns seem quaint and unnecessary. As the glow of gaslight spread, the role of the lantern carrying watchman dimmed. But it was not just the lanterns that faded. the very institution of the watch began to crumble under reform. In 1749, Henry Fielding, the novelist and magistrate, helped establish the Bow Street Runners, often considered London's first professional police force. Though small and initially limited in scope, they demonstrated what a more organized approach to policing could achieve. By the early 1800s, pressure for broader reform grew stronger, culminating in the 1829 establishment of the Metropolitan Police by Sir Robert Peel. The Bobbies, as they came to be known, were everything the Watchmen were not: younger, uniformed, disciplined, and centrally managed. They did not call the hours, nor did they carry flickering lanterns on long poles. Instead, they patrolled systematically, coordinated across districts, with clearer authority to arrest and deter crime. Compared to them, the old watchmen looked more than antiquated. They looked like relics. The transition was not instantaneous. For years, the two systems overlapped, with watchmen still patrolling some parishes, while the Metropolitan Police took over others. Some Londoners missed the familiar cries of the watch, finding the new silent patrols unsettling. Others resented the intrusion of a centralized force, feeling nostalgic for the local, if flawed, guardians of the night. But gradually, one system eclipsed the other. By the mid-19th century, the watchmen of colonial London had faded into memory, their lantern laws repealed, their cries of the hours silenced. And yet, if you walk the streets of London today, there are faint traces of them still. In some parishes, plaques mark the locations of old watch houses. A few of these structures even survive, converted into shops or private homes, their original function forgotten by passers-by. Literary echoes also preserve them. Shakespeare, Ben Jonson, and later satirists immortalized their bumbling, sleepy watchmen in plays and verse. In paintings and engravings, their lanterns still glow faintly, casting light on foggy streets long vanished. The legacy of the lantern laws is subtler, but no less enduring. The idea that the city should be illuminated at night, that darkness is a matter of public concern, shaped urban development for centuries to come. Public lighting became a responsibility of the state, not of individual households, and that shift paved the way for the electrified, brightly lit cities we know today. The notion that safety required visibility, that the very act of illumination was an act of governance, was first written into law through those humble lantern requirements. There is, perhaps, something oddly poetic about it. A group of underpaid, elderly men, mocked by their contemporaries for dozing on duty, carried out a nightly ritual that symbolized the city's determination to impose order on the darkness. Their lanterns may have been dim, their staves more symbolic than useful, but their presence mattered. For hundreds of years, they reassured Londoners that, even at night, the city was not entirely abandoned to chaos. Today, when we think of policing, of streetlights, or even of the reassuring hum of a city at night, we are, in some small way, heirs to the lantern laws and the watchmen who enforced them. Their story is not one of dramatic battles or heroic deeds, but of the slow, plodding march toward modern urban life, a march lit by flickering lanterns carried through the fog. And so, as you picture them on their rounds, calling the hours, knocking on doors, squinting into the shadows, you might wonder, in our own age, when cities never truly sleep, what faint rituals of order will someday seem as quaint and forgotten as the watchmen of colonial London. The streets of London in the 18th century were never truly silent, though they carried an atmosphere of caution and unease once the daylight slipped away. The city had grown swollen with trade, population, and the constant hum of carriages, yet after dusk, darkness settled over its alleys and lanes like a blanket that seemed to muffle even the noise. For most Londoners, the night was not an invitation to leisure, but a time to bolt doors, shutter windows, and pray that nothing stirred outside that might threaten their peace. Those who moved about after sundown relied on one familiar figure, the night watchman, trudging along with his lantern, stave, and the monotonous duty of keeping order. Night patrols in this era were built on the older tradition of the parish watch, but by the 18th century they had become a recognized institution in most London wards. Each parish was responsible for hiring men to carry out nightly patrols, and though the law technically required residents to share in the duty, wealthier citizens paid to avoid it. Substitutes and hired men filled the ranks, forming a patchwork system that kept the city moving under the cover of night. The watchmen were divided into patrols. A ward might assign half a dozen men to circle a set of streets, calling the hours and making their presence known. These patrols were slow and repetitive, but that was the point. The visible presence of authority, however sleepy or ineffectual it might appear, was meant to discourage thieves and troublemakers. With their swinging lanterns and rhythmic cries, past 10 o'clock, and a fair night, they formed a kind of human clock, reminding the city that even in darkness, time marched forward. The lantern itself was more than just a tool for seeing in the dark. Lanterns were part of London's legal code, bound up in regulations that demanded households display external lighting during certain months. From Michaelmas to Lady Day, roughly late September through late March, lanterns were to burn at set hours. The watch ensured compliance, knocking on doors when lamps went out or when residents failed to display them at all. They were the city's enforcers of illumination, in the most literal sense. The duties of a patrol extended beyond lanterns. Watchmen checked that shop doors were barred, that windows were closed, and that no suspicious characters loitered in the shadows. Apprentices wandering late could be questioned, drunkards ushered home, and the occasional brawl broken up with a wave of the stave. If the disturbance was serious enough, watchmen had authority to haul offenders to the nearest watch house, where they might be held until a constable or magistrate dealt with them come morning. Of course, the effectiveness of these patrols varied widely. A determined gang of robbers could easily evade a handful of elderly men carrying lanterns. Thieves quickly learned the routes and timing of patrols, slipping into alleys or ducking into taverns when the watch approached. The watchmen themselves were often mocked for their age and wariness. Satirical prints showed them dozing against lampposts, their lanterns casting faint light over their own sleeping faces. And yet, despite their reputation, their very presence deterred enough trouble to justify their nightly rounds. The life of a patrolman was monotonous and physically taxing. The shift began around 9 in the evening, lasting until sunrise. Patrols moved slowly, covering the same ground repeatedly, their cries echoing through the streets at regular intervals. Cold, damp air seeped through their cloaks in winter, while summer brought long stretches of quiet walking broken only by the sound of their own boots. Many leaned heavily on their staves, not as weapons, but as supports for aching bodies. Watch houses dotted the city, serving as both shelters for the watch and holding places for the unruly. Inside, the patrol could warm themselves by a fire, rest on benches, or share food between rounds. The watch house was often a hub of local gossip, where tradesmen, constables, and parish officers gathered to discuss the events of the night. A watchman might take a brief nap there, though too much rest could invite ridicule or reprimand if discovered. What gave the patrols their peculiar character was the ritual of announcing the hours. This practice dated back centuries, but in 18th century London it had become an expected part of the city's nightly rhythm. Residents lying awake in bed would listen for the cries, marking the time in their heads. Some found the calls reassuring, others infuriatingly disruptive. Diaries and letters record both sentiments, one man praising the watch for keeping the city alive at night with their diligent cries, another cursing them for waking him every hour without fail. The lanterns, though dim, played their own role in the nightly theatre. Fueled by oil, often with smoky flames behind sooty glass panes, they cast narrow circles of light that cut through the fog. To see a lantern bobbing down the street was to know a watchman was near, a beacon of authority however weakly it glowed. For criminals, that glow was a warning. For travellers, it was a comfort. For householders, it was sometimes an irritation, especially if a watchman rapped on their door to remind them that their own lantern had gone out. Night patrols also intersected with larger social and cultural patterns of the city. The 18th century was an age of taverns, coffee houses, and theatres, many of which operated late into the evening. Watchmen were often tasked with dispersing unruly crowds spilling into the streets after closing hours. Apprentices celebrating seasonal festivals, such as Shrove Tuesday or May Day, might clash with the watch, turning otherwise dull patrols into chaotic confrontations. Drunken sailors and soldiers, newly arrived in port, were another source of trouble, their loud singing and brawls forcing the watch to intervene. Enforcing lantern laws might seem tedious, but for the watchmen it was a cornerstone of their authority. A darkened street was not merely inconvenient, it was considered dangerous. Lanterns reduced accidents, helped prevent crime, and symbolized order itself. The expectation that every household would maintain some form of light was woven into the city's sense of discipline. A patrolman checking lamps was, in essence, ensuring that the city's residents played their part in maintaining safety. The reality, of course, was messier. Poorer families often struggled to afford the oil needed to keep lamps burning. The cost was not insignificant, and fines for non-compliance could sting. Some families quietly extinguished their lamps after the patrol passed, relighting them only if the watch returned. Others left lamps unlit altogether, gambling that the patrol would overlook their doorway. Watchmen, for their part, were not always eager to press fines on their neighbors, preferring instead to issue warnings. Despite these tensions, the lantern laws endured throughout the century. They represented an early form of communal responsibility for safety, an acknowledgement that the city was only as secure as the willingness of its residents to comply with small but important regulations. For the watch, enforcing these laws gave purpose to their patrols, tying their nightly rounds into the larger rhythm of London's life. Yet beneath the monotony of the patrols, there lingered a growing sense that the system was fragile. The city was expanding rapidly, its population swelling, its crime more organized and bold. Could sleepy patrols with lanterns and staves truly keep pace with the changing face of London? The 18th century watchman was a curious mix of tradition, necessity, and compromise. His nightly patrol embodied centuries-old practices, yet the world around him was changing in ways that exposed the limitations of his role. To understand how these patrols functioned and how they were perceived, we must look closer at the lives of the men themselves, the spaces they guarded, and the expectations of the communities they served. Most watchmen were drawn from the lower strata of society. Many were too old or infirm to perform heavy labor, but still capable of walking a beat. Parish officers deliberately recruited such men because they accepted lower wages than younger workers. An elderly porter or former soldier might find in the watch steady employment that required more endurance than strength. Parish records from the period list men with grey hair and stooped shoulders serving until their 70s. In fact, age itself became a common criticism of the watch. Pamphleteers derided them as decrepit and half asleep, unsuited to deter criminals who were often young, strong, and desperate. Yet these men were not without experience. Veterans of earlier wars carried scars and memories that lent them a certain resilience. Artisans brought knowledge of local streets and alleys, having worked them for decades. They knew which taverns attracted trouble, which alleys concealed thieves, and which merchants were prone to leaving shutters unlocked. In that sense, the watchmen embodied a form of local knowledge that no centralized force could replicate. Their lanterns illuminated not just the streets, but the accumulated wisdom of men who had lived their entire lives in the same ward. Pay, however, remained meagre. 6 pence a night was common, with occasional bonuses during festive seasons. Many watchmen supplemented their income by doing odd jobs during the day, carting goods, running errands, or assisting tradesmen. Sleep was irregular, their nights consumed by patrol, and their days often sacrificed to survival. That exhaustion fed the stereotype of the dozing watchman, leaning on his staff, lantern flickering beside him. The public saw laziness. In truth, it was fatigue. The patrol itself was both ritualistic and pragmatic. A watchman would set off at the hour, his lantern swinging, stave in hand, calling the time and weather as he went. These cries were not arbitrary. They served to reassure households, signal the progress of the patrol, and remind residents of the watch's presence. Past 11 o'clock and a misty night announced more than the time, It announced that order still held, that someone was awake and moving through the darkness. The cries could be elaborate. Some watchmen added verses, rhymes, or humorous phrases, turning their duty into a kind of performance. Others stuck to the formula, repeating the same words hour after hour, their voices blending with the sounds of distant bells. For residents, these calls became part of the city's nocturnal soundtrack. At once irritating, comforting, and strangely predictable, beyond their cries, patrols faced genuine challenges. Fires were ever-present threats, and the watch bore responsibility for raising alarms. They carried rattles, wooden noise makers designed to summon neighbors when flames were spotted. A watchman discovering smoke might rattle furiously, his lantern casting frantic light as residents poured into the streets with buckets. Success depended less on his physical prowess than on his vigilance, and in this regard even the oldest watchman could prove invaluable. Crime, however, tested them more severely. Pickpockets, highwaymen, and organized gangs of thieves plagued 18th century London. Watchmen were expected to deter these with little more than a stave and a lantern. Alone, or in pairs, they could be easily overpowered. Many criminals laughed off their authority, knowing that watchmen lacked both numbers and weapons to resist. In response, some patrols adapted by banding together in larger groups, sweeping through particularly troubled streets with lanterns raised. Others relied on reputation, using stern voices and confident strides to mask their vulnerability. The lantern laws remained central to their work. Each evening, watchmen checked that residents complied, ensuring lights hung outside houses at prescribed times. This ritual tied the private household to the public good. Illumination was not simply a matter of personal choice, but of communal safety. For wealthier families, the cost of oil was minor. For poorer ones, it was burdensome. Complaints about the expense appear frequently in parish records. Yet the watch pressed on, knocking on doors and reminding households of their obligations. These nightly interactions gave the watch an oddly domestic role. Unlike modern police, they were not distant enforcers, but familiar figures, known by name to the residents they disturbed. A shopkeeper might grumble when awakened to relight his lamp, yet he also relied on the same watchman to notice if shutters were broken or thieves prowled too near. Relationships of annoyance and reliance intertwined, creating a dynamic unique to the era. The watch houses scattered across London embodied this balance of authority and community. Some were substantial brick buildings, others were little more than wooden sheds. Inside, benches lined the walls, a fire flickered in the hearth, and lanterns were tended between rounds. Watchmen rested there, sometimes sharing food or gossip, sometimes dozing until it was time to patrol again. Offenders brought in for drunkenness or brawling joined them, sleeping uncomfortably until morning. The atmosphere was often more communal than punitive, reflecting the blurred line between neighborly supervision and law enforcement. Criticism of the watch grew sharper as the century advanced. Reformers argued that the city's growth demanded something more professional. The Bow Street Runners, founded in 1749, provided a stark contrast. Paid officers tasked with serious investigations, coordinated under magistrates, rather than sleepy parish men calling hours. Public opinion shifted, with newspapers highlighting crimes the watch had failed to prevent. Yet nostalgia for the old system persisted. Many Londoners valued the familiarity of the watch, the rhythm of their cries, the sight of their lanterns swaying in the fog. Reform threatened not just inefficiency, but tradition itself. Some defended the watch as an emblem of local autonomy, each parish responsible for its own order. The lantern laws, too, were defended as civic rituals, tying the community together in shared responsibility. By the late 18th century, however, it was clear that the balance was tipping. Gaslight experiments hinted at a future where illumination no longer relied on household compliance. Centralized policing models, though controversial, offered more consistent enforcement. The watch remained, but increasingly as a relic, mocked in satire, tolerated in practice, and overshadowed by reform. Still, for those who lived in London during this period, the night patrols remained a familiar presence. Whether loved or loathed, they marked the city's rhythm. Their lanterns flickered in windows, Their cries echoed through narrow lanes, and their wary footsteps reminded residents that someone, however imperfectly, kept watch. And so the question lingers. As the 18th century drew to a close, could the old patrols adapt to a city on the edge of modernization, or were they destined to fade into memory like the lanterns they carried? The decline of the parish watch in 18th century London was neither sudden nor uniform. It unfolded in a slow, almost sleepy rhythm, befitting the men who carried lanterns and called the hours. Yet, beneath that surface calm, the city was transforming in ways that would make their role increasingly untenable. By mid-century, London had grown into the largest city in Europe. Its population surged past 600 Zullos, and its streets stretched farther than ever before, and its nocturnal life became busier and more complex. Taverns, coffeehouses, and theatres thrived well into the night, while commerce extended beyond daylight hours. This was no longer a medieval town, where silence fell with dusk. It was an emerging metropolis, restless and illuminated. The lantern laws, once sufficient to scatter darkness, seemed quaint when applied to such scale. The inadequacies of the watch became easy targets for writers and satirists. Popular prints depicted them as bumbling, half-blind old men, leaning on staves while thieves slipped by. In 1764, a satirical poem mocked them as snoring guardians, lanterns dim, asleep while rogues do swim. Such portrayals may have exaggerated their failures, but they resonated with a public increasingly frustrated by crime. Highwaymen haunted the outskirts, gangs roamed the alleys, and housebreakers grew bolder. The cry of "past midnight" and "all's well" rang hollow to those who awoke to discover their shutters pried open. Criticism spurred debate. Should parishes continue to rely on their own men, chosen by local officers and funded by parish rates? Or should London move toward a centralized system, one that could train, equip, and supervise its night watch with consistency? The Bow Street magistrates, especially Henry Fielding, and later his half-brother John, pressed for reform. Their Bow Street runners demonstrated what a small, disciplined force could achieve when backed by legal authority. Compared to them, the parish watch looked antiquated. Nevertheless, defenders of the watch argued for its local character. A parish watchman knew his neighbours. He might tolerate a tipsy apprentice staggering home, scolding him gently rather than hauling him before a magistrate. He might check in on an ailing widow, ensuring her lamp was lit and her shutters secured. Such acts were rarely recorded, but they stitched the fabric of community life. To replace the watch with a faceless, uniformed body, critics feared, would strip away that intimacy. Practicalities also delayed reform. Funding a professional force required more than parish rates. It required political will and city-wide coordination. Many parishes balked at losing their autonomy. Others simply lacked the resources to modernize. Thus, the old system lingered, even as its shortcomings grew glaring. The lantern laws illustrate this tension well. Enacted in earlier centuries, they had compelled households to contribute directly to the city's illumination. But as experiments with gaslight spread, first in demonstrations, then in limited street installations, the reliance on oil lamps and watchmen's inspections looked increasingly out of date. By the 1790s, gas companies promised brighter, more reliable light that required no nightly knocking at doors. In a sense, technology itself was rendering the lantern law obsolete. For the watchmen, this shift carried personal implications. Their authority lay not only in calling the hours, but in enforcing small acts of compliance. Checking lamps, patrolling alleys, rattling alarms. As these duties diminished, so too did their relevance. Some watchmen resisted, clinging to their rituals, others adapted, finding roles within new systems or retreating into retirement. Yet, despite decline, the watch never entirely lost its dignity. Parish minutes record moments of bravery, an elderly watchman pursuing thieves down an alley, another raising an alarm that saved half a street from fire, others detaining suspicious strangers until dawn. These deeds rarely made headlines, but they mattered to those directly protected. Even critics who mocked their inefficiency admitted that the watch was better than nothing. The watch houses, too, carried a symbolic weight. They were small outposts of communal order, scattered like lanterns themselves across the sprawling city. At night, They glowed faintly, fires flickering within, while outside the streets sank into fog. Residents knew that inside, however imperfectly, someone was awake, staff in hand, ready to rattle an alarm. By the turn of the 19th century, momentum for reform became irresistible. The London Police Bill of 1829, creating the Metropolitan Police, would finally sweep away the old parish watchers. But before that, a transitional period unfolded, decades in which the watch coexisted uneasily with emerging forces. To walk through London in those years was to encounter both worlds, the flickering lantern of a wary watchman and the firmer stride of a Bow Street runner or early constable. For the watchmen themselves, memory softened the judgment. Those who had spent years calling the hours often looked back with quiet pride. Their service may have been mocked, but it was service nonetheless. They had borne cold nights, wandering fog-filled streets, guided only by oil lamps and instinct. They had endured ridicule from passers-by, insults from drunks, and occasional blows from desperate thieves. And through it all, they had kept the city's heartbeat, however faint, alive through the darkness. In the end, the story of London's 18th century night patrols is one of transition. It is the story of an institution rooted in medieval custom, stretched to breaking point by a modernizing city. It is the story of lanterns, once symbols of communal duty, yielding to gaslight and eventually electricity. It is the story of men, ordinary and often frail, who walk their beats not as heroes, but as neighbors tasked with an impossible job. And perhaps most of all, it is a story of rhythm. The steady cries of "past 1 o'clock" and "a cloudy morning" echo still, faintly through the historical imagination. They remind us of a London caught between old and new, a city illuminated just enough to stumble forward into modernity. In the dim glow of a medieval London evening, the air filled with the smell of tallow candles and wood smoke drifting lazily from hearths. The cobblestones beneath your feet are uneven, worn smooth in some places by the boots of countless merchants, apprentices, and guild masters who tread these paths each day. Somewhere down the street, the rhythmic sound of a cooper hammering iron bands onto a barrel fades into the steady clop of a cartwheel. You find yourself not in the bustle of markets or the shadow of churches, but rather at the quiet intersections where family and trade entwine, where marriage was more than a matter of affection, and instead an extension of commerce, protection, and survival. This is the world of matchmaking among London's medieval guild families, a world where the vow, "till death do us part," often began at the negotiation table. The guilds of London in the medieval centuries were not simply trade organizations. They were, in many respects, the glue that held the city together, enforcing standards of production, ensuring apprenticeships, and even acting as a form of civic government. Yet behind the dry records of ordinances and charters lay a social web, one that revolved around alliances created through marriage. If you were the son or daughter of a prominent guildmaster, your marital prospects had less to do with your smile or manner of conversation, and far more to do with the guild you belonged to, the property your family controlled, and the reputation carried by your surname. In essence, love was never entirely absent, but it often arrived late to the wedding feast, long after contracts had been signed and dowries arranged. Picture for a moment a draper's household in Cheapside. The draper himself is a man of middling prosperity, respected among his fellows, though not the wealthiest of his craft. He has a daughter nearing the marriageable age of 15 or 16, and though she spends much of her day supervising servants, mending linens, and assisting her mother with brewing ale, her real role is something more subtle. She is a valuable connection waiting to be matched. The draper will meet with other guild men, often informally at feasts or gatherings, and conversations will drift, perhaps not unlike the way you might overhear colleagues today discussing promotions or opportunities. Except here, the opportunity is marriage. Who has a son ready for apprenticeship and matrimony? Which families have the wealth to provide a suitable dowry? Which alliances will strengthen the guild's hold on trade or city politics? Marriage, in this sense, was part of a wider economic system. The medieval guilds were fiercely protective of their privileges. By controlling entry through apprenticeship and membership fees, they ensured that only the right families had access to their trade. Marriages functioned as another form of gatekeeping. A marriage arranged between two guild families kept wealth and influence circulating within a closed circle, reinforcing boundaries and ensuring that outsiders, those unconnected to the guild system, found it difficult to break in. You might say that these marriages created invisible walls around the guilds, walls every bit as firm as the stone that enclosed the city. But what did this mean for the people themselves? For the sons and daughters who lived inside these arrangements? Imagine being the son of a fishmonger's guild master. Your father has spent decades securing his place, paying the right dues, attending every meeting of the fraternity, donating generously to the guild chapel. When your marriage is being considered, it is not your laughter in the tavern or your gentle hand in handling fish that matters. It is the dowry the bride's family can bring, perhaps the promise of a property near the riverfront or a share in the profits of a busy stall at Billingsgate. The bride, on her side, brings not only her family's wealth but also the connections of her uncles, cousins, and wider kin. Every handshake, every signed contract, every whispered arrangement at a feast carries a weight that goes beyond two individuals. One of the peculiar details, and one that feels almost invisible in the modern world, was how marriages were often tied to the rhythms of apprenticeship. For a boy, entering an apprenticeship around the age of 12 or 13, the next 7 years would be spent in the household of a master. These households were often as much about grooming future family alliances as they were about teaching the mysteries of a craft. A master with an eligible daughter might very well be training his future son in law, weaving economic and marital futures into the same long thread. The guild system, in this way, turned daily labor into courtship, though the courtship was silent, more economic than emotional. It is easy to imagine a young woman's life within this system as one of confinement, and in many ways it was. Daughters were often pawns in the larger game of commerce. But this is not to say they lacked influence entirely. A carefully chosen marriage could elevate an entire family, and mothers played a crucial role in negotiating these unions. A mother might whisper advice to her husband, suggest the best match, or carefully manage the presentation of her daughter at feasts or church gatherings. The weaving of cloth and the weaving of marriages were not so different. Both required patience, attention to detail, and a knowledge of how the smallest strands could form a lasting fabric. And, of course, these arrangements were not without their frictions. Not every union produced harmony. Some guild records speak of disputes that spilled out into the streets, quarrels between families over dowry payments, accusations of dishonor, and the occasional annulment sought in ecclesiastical courts. The church, always watching over marriage, had its own say. It emphasized that marriages required consent of the individuals, but, in practice, family pressure was a force as strong as canon law. A boy or girl might be asked if they consented, but how free was that consent when the weight of trade, fortune, and reputation pressed down? You might think of it this way: walking through the guildhalls of medieval London, you would hear not only the clatter of tools and the murmur of business negotiations, but also the quieter, subtler conversations about sons, daughters, and alliances. Guild feasts were not just about roasted meats and ale flowing freely, but about evaluating the character of families, testing the waters of potential alliances. Even the smallest gestures, who sat where, who raised a cup to whom, could hint at futures being shaped, unions being arranged. Yet here lies an unresolved curiosity. In all of this practical matchmaking, what happened to love? Did it simply never appear, drowned beneath ledgers and contracts? Or did it emerge in unexpected places, at the shared bench of an apprenticeship workshop, or in the fleeting glances exchanged at a feast when elders were too busy debating dowries to notice? Perhaps affection, like a quiet stream, still found its way through the heavy stones of obligation. And so, as you rest among these guild families, ask yourself, in a world where marriage was business, where did the business of the heart find its place? The clang of church bells rippled across medieval London, their sound marking not only the hours of prayer, but also the pacing of life itself. Inside this rhythm, the families of guild members carried on their rituals, and matchmaking was one of the most carefully woven. If Section 1 was about the structure of guild marriages, the why of alliances, then the daily rituals and traditions formed the how, and in this, the customs were as intricate as the embroidery on a merchant's gown. A marriage negotiation rarely began with a declaration of love, or even a simple proposal. It often began with a feast. Feasts were not merely moments of merriment, but carefully staged events where reputations were tested and alliances sniffed out like the spices on a well-prepared roast. Imagine stepping into a guild hall lit with flickering torches and lamps. The tables are long, covered with trenchers of bread and dishes of fish or roasted fowl, spiced with pepper or saffron, that had travelled all the way from the Levant. Cups of ale and wine moved down the rows of men, apprentices seated at one end, masters at another, and wives and daughters clustered in corners, their voices quieter, but their eyes observing everything. In this setting, conversations about trade naturally turned toward family. A master might compliment another's shipment of cloth, and then, casually, mention his son's good progress in apprenticeship. The reply, carefully measured, might note that his own daughter was nearing marriageable age. The food on the table was nourishing, but the real nourishment was in these exchanges, subtle, cautious, and weighted with possibility. Dowries were the next step in these negotiations. A daughter's dowry was more than a sum of money. It could include land, apprenticeships, business shares, or even rights to a particular stall in a busy market. To modern ears it might sound transactional, but for a medieval family it was an investment. Both sides sought security, stability, and upward mobility. If a draper's daughter married into a family of goldsmiths, her dowry might support the opening of a new shop, and in turn, the goldsmith's family would secure a steady supply of fine cloth. These practical exchanges were not cynical. They were survival strategies, binding families in a world where fortunes could rise or fall with a single bad harvest or a ship lost at sea. The church, however, loomed as the final authority. Every match required its blessing, and ecclesiastical courts often mediated disputes. Imagine a young woman insisting she did not wish to marry a particular suitor. Canon law required her consent, but family pressure weighed heavily. In some cases, church courts intervened, annulling marriages where coercion was too blatant. Yet the line was fine, and many young couples found themselves bound not by affection, but by a quiet nod made in the shadow of expectation. Festivities themselves offered a stage for these negotiations. Weddings were not just unions of individuals but of households, entire networks of kin and neighbours. A wedding procession might wind its way through narrow streets, with neighbours tossing flowers or shouting blessings. For a guild family, such public display was as much about prestige as piety. The more elaborate the feast, the music, the roasted meats, the barrels of ale, the greater the demonstration of a family's standing. And in turn, guests watched closely, noting who had been seated near the high table, who received the choicest morsels, and which families left looking satisfied or slighted. Behind these great spectacles were quieter rituals. A mother arranging her daughter's wedding gown, embroidered with symbols of her father's trade. A father negotiating with care the exact wording of a marriage contract, down to who would inherit which chest of silverware. Apprentices whispering about which daughter of which guild master might soon be engaged, their conversations mixing envy with ambition. These daily moments reveal how marriage and matchmaking were stitched into the very fabric of guild life, not as rare events but as ongoing concerns. What's most striking, perhaps, is how the entire community participated. Marriage in guild families was not a private affair, it was communal, a matter of pride and gossip, blessing and envy. When a marriage joined two guild families, it wasn't just about husband and wife. It was about two entire networks of relatives, allies, and future apprentices. Each union reshaped the social landscape of medieval London just a little, as if one stone had been shifted in a carefully balanced wall. Even disputes, as much as they caused frustration, were woven into this communal pattern. A disagreement over dowry payments might be resolved at a guild meeting, with fellow masters acting as arbiters. A broken betrothal could ripple through the community, sparking whispers at market stalls and behind church pews. Marriage was as public as it was private, a negotiation and a performance, a contract and a ceremony. And yet, for all its formality, there was still room for surprise. Feasts might set the stage for alliances, but sometimes apprentices and daughters, in the bustle of service and conversation, caught each other's eyes in ways their elders never planned. Even in a world of contracts and dowries, chance encounters still stirred hearts. Perhaps that is why so many guild rules and ordinances repeated the same concerns, warning against clandestine marriages, urging respect for parental authority, reminding members to maintain the dignity of their guild. It was as though the very existence of these laws betrayed the truth, that love, unpredictable and unregulated, could never be entirely kept out. And so, as you settle into this chapter of medieval life, imagine the glow of torches in a smoky hall, the clink of cups, the hum of conversation layered with laughter, negotiation, and song. In that dimly lit space, you would see the future of guild families being quietly decided, not in whispers of passion, but in the measured tone of men and women securing alliances for generations to come. The records of London's guild families show that the mechanics of matchmaking were not only theoretical but alive in countless real unions. Parish registers, guild rolls, and court cases allow us to trace the way these marriages played out, the tensions they resolved, and sometimes the ones they created. To read these records today is to see a city not just of grand cathedrals and noisy markets, but of households bound together by carefully chosen alliances. One striking example comes from the Drapers' Company, one of the wealthiest guilds in medieval London. A prominent draper, Thomas Alleyn, arranged for his daughter to marry into the family of a wealthy mercer. The drapers and mercers were not always allies. In fact, they competed fiercely in the cloth trade. Yet, through marriage, enmity softened into alliance. The dowry included not only money, but also the right to use certain storage spaces within London's ports, rights that otherwise would have remained hotly contested. The marriage contract is preserved in fragments, revealing meticulous lists, sums of coin, bolts of cloth, and even livestock included in the agreement. This was not just the marriage of two individuals, it was an economic treaty signed with rings and vows, instead of quills and seals. Other cases were less straightforward. The Goldsmiths' Company, with its wealth and prestige, often sought alliances with families of rising trades. In one record, a goldsmith's son was betrothed to a brewer's daughter. The match raised eyebrows because brewing, though profitable, lacked the social esteem of goldsmithing. Yet the brewer's family brought in enormous wealth, and the union allowed the goldsmiths to tap into a new network of taverns and inns where their coins circulated. What seemed mismatched on paper became, in practice, a partnership of economic powerhouses. Women, though often seen as pawns in these negotiations, were not without influence. A widow of a guild master could wield considerable power, her remarriage reshaping alliances and even shifting balances of power within a guild. Take the case of Margaret Parston, though not a Londoner but from Norfolk, whose letters provide remarkable insight into how women navigated these negotiations. Widows in London guilds often echoed Margaret's strategies, choosing husbands who secured not just their household, but their business interests. Some widows even continue to run shops in their own names, a reminder that marriage did not always erase a woman's role in commerce. And then there were the disputes. In 14th century records of the Bishop of London's court, one finds repeated cases of broken betrothals. A young man might promise marriage to one woman, only to be accused later of marrying another. Families sued to reclaim dowries, and guild elders sometimes stepped in to arbitrate. The fact that so many such cases survived tells us that the process was fraught. Behind the smooth facade of arranged alliances lay tensions, disappointments, and betrayals that could not always be hushed up. The politics of London itself were not immune to these alliances. Guild families who aligned through marriage often presented unified voices in city politics. A coalition of grocers and fishmongers, for example, emerged in the late 14th century, not merely out of shared commercial interests, but through a dense web of intermarriages. When they voted in the election of sheriffs or aldermen, their alliances carried weight. The civic government of medieval London, ostensibly built on laws and customs, was in practice shaped by the dinner tables and dowry contracts of guild households. Even rebellions and riots carried traces of these alliances. During the uprising of 1381, some guild families found themselves split, with sons-in-law on opposite sides of the conflict. The records show how painful such divisions could be, loyalties strained between kinship and political conviction. It is easy to forget that grand historical events are lived out in private households, where a husband and wife might whisper anxiously about which banners to support, knowing that their marriage connected them to both camps. The endurance of these guild marriages is perhaps most visible in the material world they left behind. Churches across London bear brasses and tombs commemorating couples, their hands joined in stone, their heraldic symbols etched side by side. These are not mere memorials to affection. They are public declarations of alliance designed to remind future generations of the union of families. Even after death, the marriages continued to speak, reinforcing the bonds that had shaped the city. As we step back from these stories, what emerges is a portrait of a city woven together by marriages that were, in their quiet way, as important as charters and treaties. Every feast, every dowry contract, every whispered negotiation in a guild hall contributed to the structure of medieval London. Behind the facades of trade and politics were households, and behind those households were marriages, sometimes harmonious, sometimes tense, but always consequential. Perhaps the real lesson is that history is not only made in moments of war or royal decree. It is made just as much in the slow, careful building of families, the daily work of arranging lives so that households might endure. The forgotten watchmen of lantern lit streets played their part in keeping order. The guild families of London played theirs in keeping the city bound together. And so, when you walk through the old city of London today, past the livery halls and churches that still stand, you are walking across the web of those alliances. They may seem invisible, but their traces remain in the very shape of London's institutions, its streets, and its traditions. It leaves us with a question. When we think of the great builders of cities and societies, do we give enough weight to the quiet negotiations of households, the hands clasped in marriage, the tables where dowries were counted? Evening in 18th century London was a curious mixture of noise and intimacy. By day, the city was a place of clamour, carts rattling over cobblestones, hawkers calling out their wares, apprentices rushing with deliveries. But when the sun set and shutters closed, an entirely different rhythm unfolded. For those who were young, unmarried, and seeking companionship, the evening hours became the proper stage for a practice known simply as evening visits. Courting, in this period, was not a matter of stolen glances in public squares, so much as carefully timed and often supervised encounters in drawing rooms, lit by the warm flicker of candles. The architecture of these visits was as precise as the lace on a lady's sleeve. A young man, properly dressed, would arrive at a respectable hour, never too late to suggest impropriety, never too early to appear overeager. He would carry with him a sense of deference, perhaps a small token such as a ribbon or a sprig of flowers, but more often he brought only conversation. In households across the city, these evening calls were the first step in what might become a lifelong partnership. Families, deeply invested in the outcomes, hovered nearby, sometimes literally seated in the same room, their watchful eyes measuring every word exchanged. Candles, more than a source of light, shaped the atmosphere. Their glow softened the edges of rooms, casting shadows that made everything seem at once private and exposed. A gentleman seated opposite a young woman might lean forward ever so slightly, careful that his posture conveyed interest, but not over-familiarity. A lady, her face illuminated by the gentle flame, would listen attentively, her fan perhaps tapping against her lap in a rhythm only she understood. In these small gestures, how long a glance lingered, how a hand adjusted a sleeve, lay the subtle language of courtship. Evening visits were not confined to the gentry or nobility. They filtered down through the middling ranks of society as well, in modest parlours of shopkeepers and artisans. The same rituals played out, though without the heavy drapes and fine china of wealthier households. Instead, simple chairs, a modest fire, and a single candlestick provided the stage. Yet the stakes were just as high, for marriage was not only a personal bond, but an economic strategy. For a shopkeeper's daughter, the suitor's prospects might mean the difference between expanding the family's trade or struggling to keep the shutters open. Etiquette manuals of the period emphasized restraint. A young man was expected to speak with wit, but avoid impropriety, to praise a lady's accomplishments without lapsing into excessive flattery. He might inquire after her music, her needlework, or her reading, subjects considered both safe and revealing. A woman, for her part, was expected to respond with modest charm, displaying just enough intelligence to hold his attention, while never appearing overly learned, which was sometimes regarded with suspicion. Beneath these formal rules, however, ran the deeper current of genuine human curiosity. How two people chose to bend or follow the rules often determined whether a courtship would flourish. One striking detail of these visits was their repetition. Rarely did a single evening lead to decisive outcomes. Suitors returned week after week, building a rhythm that households recognized as part of the process. Families tracked these visits almost like an unwritten ledger. How often the gentleman called, how long he stayed, whether he came despite inclement weather. Absence or neglect signaled waning interest. Persistence suggested seriousness. For women, this cadence could be reassuring or exhausting, depending on their own inclinations. Supervision remained a constant. Parents, siblings, or trusted servants often hovered, sometimes seated at the same table, sometimes positioned in adjacent rooms with doors carefully left ajar. Privacy, in the modern sense, was rare. Yet within the boundaries of this surveillance, couples learned to carve out moments of intimacy. A phrase whispered while pouring tea, a fleeting touch of fingers when exchanging a cup, or a glance held just a little too long. These gestures might seem trifling, but in an era when reputations could rise or fall on whispers, they carried enormous weight. The material culture of evening visits further reveals their importance. Candlesticks polished to a glow, tea sets arranged with precision, and even the arrangement of chairs, all spoke to the family's intent to present their daughter in the best possible light. The consumption of tea itself, still relatively expensive in the early 18th century, signaled refinement. To pour tea gracefully was a social performance, a chance for a young woman to display composure under observation. The suitor, meanwhile, revealed his manners in how he accepted the cup, how he addressed not only the daughter but her family, and whether he respected the rhythms of the household. As the century progressed, the practice evolved. Increasingly, novels and plays depicted scenes of evening courtship, reflecting and shaping expectations. Characters in Richardson's Pamela or Burney's Evelina moved through similar drawing rooms, their fates turning on the smallest gestures of decorum or breach of propriety. Literature, in this sense, both mirrored and reinforced the rituals of real London households, reminding young men and women of the consequences of missteps. Yet beneath the candlelit politeness lay practical concerns. Families assessed not just affection but fortune. A suitor's financial stability, prospects of inheritance, and connections within trade or politics weighed heavily. The candlelight softened appearances, but it did not obscure the arithmetic of marriage. Dowries, settlements, and the consolidation of property remained essential. A charming smile alone could not overcome inadequate means. Though it might sometimes delay the inevitable decision, the rhythm of these visits also intersected with the wider life of the city. London evenings were not silent. Outside the windows, watchmen patrolled. Vendors lingered, and the occasional drunken voice carried through the night. The flicker of indoor candles contrasted with the lanterns carried through the streets. A suitor leaving a household after an evening call stepped into a city still alive with noise, his thoughts perhaps a mixture of romantic hope and practical calculation. The glow of candles inside and the dim lanterns outside symbolized two worlds, one intimate, one public, both essential to the fabric of London life. By the end of the century, some critics complained that evening visits were becoming too prolonged, that young men lingered too late, disrupting the proper order of households. Satirical prints mocked suitors who overstayed their welcome, depicted yawning fathers, or lampooned young women who entertained too many callers at once. These satires remind us that even in their time, evening visits were subject to debate, not merely timeless traditions. Still, the practice endured because it met a deep need. It created a space where affection and strategy could intertwine, where individuals could come to know one another within the boundaries of respectability. The candlelight, the careful etiquette, the rhythm of repeated visits, all these details stitch together the path from acquaintance to engagement. And yet, as we think of those evenings, another question lingers. Beneath the rules and rituals, how much freedom did these young people truly have to choose? Were they shaping their destinies by candlelight, or were they simply moving within the patterns set for them by families and society? Candles dwindled slowly as hours passed, and the gentle hiss of tallow or beeswax marked the progress of time. The dimming flame was a silent clock, reminding both families and visitors that courtship was as much a matter of patience as passion. In 18th century London, these evening visits were not simply a romantic indulgence. They were a social currency, carefully watched and measured by the wider community. Neighbours noticed who came and went, servants whispered about how late a guest lingered, and even tradesmen passing by the house might register the frequency of a particular caller. In a city that thrived on gossip as much as on commerce, a young woman's prospects could be made or unmade not just by her conduct, but by the very pattern of visits others observed. The watchful presence of family added another layer of complexity. Fathers, often stern but pragmatic, measured the suitor's financial reliability with the same eye they used for their ledgers. Mothers observed manners, speech, and deference, knowing that the gentleman's behavior toward her daughter was only part of the story. How he treated elders, siblings, or even the household maid revealed far more than a rehearsed compliment ever could. Siblings, too, played roles in this delicate theatre. A younger brother might tease the visitor, testing his temper, while a sister hovered nearby, keen to listen in and later whisper her opinions. Rarely was a courtship the private affair of two hearts alone. Instead, it resembled a performance staged for an audience of family and community, with each gesture weighed against expectations. At the heart of these rituals was the flickering candlelight itself. Unlike the harsh clarity of daylight, the candle's glow blurred imperfections and softened expressions. A lady's gown shimmered in the dim glow, a gentleman's features appeared gentler. Yet candles were costly, particularly beeswax ones, which burned longer and cleaner than common tallow. To allow them to burn into the late evening was itself a sign of investment in the ritual. Families quite literally burned resources to sustain the atmosphere in which courtship unfolded. Music sometimes accompanied these evenings. A daughter might play a harpsichord piece or sing a light song, while the suitor listened with polite admiration. The act of performing, in a sense, allowed her to display not only skill but discipline and refinement. For the gentleman, offering encouragement and measured praise demonstrated attentiveness and social grace. Silence, too, carried meaning, the pause between words. The hush as a song ended, the moment when both seemed to wait for the other to speak. The suitor's departure was as telling as his arrival. To stay past the acceptable hour risked gossip or parental disapproval, but to leave too soon might suggest indifference. A bow at the threshold, a final exchange of glances under the faint light of the hallway candle, and the soft sound of the door closing, these small details concluded each act of the ongoing drama. Stepping back into the London night, the visitor encountered a city at once alive and strangely hushed. Watchmen shuffled with lanterns, calling out the hours. The distant bells of Staines Paul's might mark the time. The suitor walked homeward across uneven streets, perhaps rehearsing in his mind the expressions and words he had witnessed. Did her laughter seem genuine? Did her father's nod carry approval or suspicion? The quiet of the walk amplified such questions, turning every encounter into a memory to be weighed and analyzed. For the young woman left inside, the evening did not end with the extinguishing of candles. Conversations with her mother or sister followed, recounting each word, gesture or subtle change in tone. What seemed trivial, a pause, a slip of phrasing, a misplaced compliment, might be debated late into the night. The father, often silent in these conversations, nonetheless carried his own calculations, balancing affection with alliances, sentiment with stability. This constant interplay of emotion and practicality defined evening visits. They were not love stories written in sweeping gestures, but small, deliberate steps performed under candlelight, watched by family, noted by neighbors, and carried through the city's whispering streets. Even as the flicker of candlelit visits remained central to London's courtship traditions. The broader cultural world of the late 18th century began to press in on these quiet evenings. The very act of sitting across from one another in dim light, exchanging polite remarks and measured glances, was increasingly mirrored, mocked and magnified in literature, satire, and public conversation. What happened in the private parlour was never wholly private. It belonged to the city's evolving dialogue about love, propriety, and society. Printed material played no small role in shaping expectations. Courtesy manuals and conduct books, widely circulated among the literate middle classes, described in exacting detail how a gentleman should behave during visits, from how long he ought to remain seated, to the level of deference he should show when addressing the young lady's parents. These guides transformed the evening ritual into a codified exercise. For young men eager to impress, the manuals provided reassurance that propriety could be learned, if not instinctive. For women, they confirmed that their suitors' words and gestures were part of a shared script, one that could be read and judged with confidence. Yet as much as books instructed, satirical prints and plays ridiculed. Cartoonists like James Gilray and Thomas Rowlandson often drew bumbling suitors, their exaggerated bows and awkward stances lampooning the delicate rituals of courtship. Audiences laughed at depictions of greedy parents, weighing a suitor's purse more heavily than his character, or of daughters scheming to prolong visits beyond reason. These images circulated widely, appearing in shop windows and on coffeehouse tables, reminding Londoners that their private evenings existed within a public conversation about manners and marriage. The theatre, too, echoed these parlour dynamics. Comedies of manners portrayed evening visits with playful exaggeration, showing how a misplaced word or a late departure could spark gossip and scandal. Audiences recognized themselves in these portrayals, even if they insisted they were only laughing at others. The popularity of such plays confirmed that candlelit courtship was not merely an individual matter. It was part of the cultural fabric of London life, a subject of entertainment as much as earnest practice. The layering of public and private became especially visible in the city's gossip networks. Coffee houses brimmed with speculation, while printed scandal sheets delighted in stories of courtships gone awry. A suitor who lingered too long at one home or was seen slipping discreetly from another could find himself the subject of rumour. The very streets of London, lined with watchmen and punctuated by bells, acted as witnesses. To move through them late at night was to risk one's reputation becoming part of the city's whispered stories. Even as satire poked fun, genuine transformations were underway. Enlightenment ideals of individual choice and sentimental attachment were beginning to challenge older, more transactional models of marriage. The candlelit visit, with its emphasis on conversation, music, and the display of personal refinement, subtly shifted the balance. While family oversight remained, the weight placed on emotional compatibility grew heavier. A suitor's sincerity, his ability to speak earnestly of affection, rather than merely of estates or dowries, began to matter more than in earlier generations. This change was reflected in diaries and letters of the period. Young women recorded not only the fact of a visit, but also how they felt during it, whether they sensed warmth, attention, or respect. These private writings capture a quiet revolution in values. Marriage was still about stability, but it was increasingly about companionship as well. The dim glow of the evening candle became a stage for testing not only fortune, but also feeling. At the same time, economic realities remained stubborn. Families could not ignore the importance of income, inheritance, or alliances. A gentleman who spoke tenderly but lacked financial security was often still considered unsuitable. Thus, the evening visit became a balancing act between sentiment and calculation, between the pull of affection and the push of necessity. For every story of genuine romance nurtured by candlelight, there were many where the flame eventually extinguished under the weight of practicality. By the closing decades of the century, the symbolism of candlelight itself was shifting. In literature and poetry, the candle became a metaphor for fragile love, fleeting beauty, or the tension between passion and restraint. What had been a practical source of light in the parlor now carried layers of meaning, reflecting the city's broader cultural fascination with intimacy and impermanence. As London grew noisier, larger, and more crowded, the quiet ritual of evening visits stood in contrast to the bustle outside. Within a room, silence and softness prevailed. Outside, carts rumbled, watchmen called, and taverns roared with laughter. This stark difference only heightened the significance of the visit. It was a moment carved out of the city's chaos, fragile and fleeting, marked by the simple glow of a burning candle. In the end, these rituals tell us something essential about London society. That even in a city teeming with trade, crime, and political upheaval, people longed for connection and order. The rules of evening visits provided structure to the uncertainty of romance, a framework within which affection might cautiously grow. They were ordinary, repetitive, and sometimes painfully restrained. But within their boundaries, lives were changed, futures determined, and the culture of courtship quietly reshaped. And so we are left to wonder when the last candle guttered out, when footsteps faded into the night, and when silence returned to the parlor, what lingered in the minds of those who had sat across from one another? Was it relief, regret, or the slow, steady kindling of something lasting? The problem of London's darkness was never a small one. By the mid-17th century and into the 18th, the city had swollen into a sprawling metropolis, with streets that wound unpredictably, alleys that narrowed into shadows, and districts where neither moonlight nor starlight could pierce the gloom. For centuries, Londoners had navigated the night with little more than handheld lanterns, or the occasional glow spilling from tavern doors. But as the city grew denser, the risks multiplied: crime, accidents, and the uneasy sense that darkness itself invited mischief. The solution, in the eyes of city authorities, was simple in theory: legislate the light. The earliest attempts at regulating street illumination were sporadic, tied often to royal proclamations, rather than sustained civic planning. A king might issue an order requiring householders to hang lanterns outside their doors at certain hours, only for compliance to fade within months. Enforcement was weak, and the burden of responsibility rested heavily on individuals rather than the city itself. Yet the very existence of these laws reflected a growing anxiety that darkness was not merely a natural condition, but a problem to be solved, a social hazard to be managed through regulation. By the late 17th century, more systematic efforts were underway. London's lamp acts began to appear, legal frameworks that attempted to bring consistency to the city's nocturnal landscape. These laws required householders in designated areas to maintain lamps outside their properties during certain hours of the night, particularly in winter months when daylight was scarce. Failure to comply could result in fines, though the collection of these penalties was often uneven. The lamps themselves were far from uniform. Some were simple glass boxes enclosing a candle, hung from iron brackets affixed to door frames. Others were suspended in the middle of streets by ropes, swaying in the wind and casting an unsteady, flickering glow. In wealthier districts, oil lamps began to appear, burning brighter and longer than candles, though they required more maintenance. To keep them lit, men were employed to patrol the streets, trimming wicks, refilling reservoirs, and striking flints to restore flames extinguished by gusts of wind or passing carriages. Still, the effectiveness of these laws remained questionable. London's climate, with its frequent rain and fog, dulled the reach of even the most diligent lamplighters. Entire districts might remain in shadow if householders neglected their duties, creating a patchwork of light and darkness across the city. Thieves quickly learned the geography of these inconsistencies, preferring to strike in unlit alleys, while respectable citizens gravitated toward better, illuminated thoroughfares. The law might command the light, but in practice, shadow still ruled. Beyond safety, lamp laws carried a symbolic weight. They represented the city's attempt to impose order on an environment that seemed inherently unruly after dark. To legislate illumination was to declare that the night should not belong to chance, but to civic authority. In this sense, the lamps were less about practical visibility than about projecting control, reminders that even in the absence of sun, the machinery of governance persisted. Yet there was also resistance. Many householders resented the expense of maintaining lamps, particularly when oil prices rose or when glass panes were shattered by mischievous boys throwing stones. Complaints poured in that the burden fell unfairly on property owners, while those without street front houses benefited freely from the glow. Some argued that the laws infringed upon private rights, forcing individuals to subsidize a public good. The debates echoed broader tensions in London's governance: who bore responsibility for the common welfare, and how that responsibility should be enforced. The pattern of enforcement reveals much about the city's priorities. Wealthier districts tended to see stricter compliance, not only because residents could afford it, but because authorities were more invested in protecting their safety and reputations. Poorer neighborhoods, by contrast, often remained dim, their inhabitants left vulnerable to crime or accidents. Thus, even the glow of lanterns reflected social inequality, casting longer shadows in places where light was most needed. By the 18th century, the idea of regulated street lighting had taken firmer hold. Contracts were sometimes awarded to private companies to supply and maintain lamps across entire districts, shifting the burden from individual householders to organized providers. This early form of privatized public service hinted at the future shape of urban infrastructure. Still, the work was arduous, requiring teams of lamplighters to set out each evening with long poles tipped with flames, igniting hundreds of lamps one by one. The introduction of oil lamps marked a modest technological improvement, but it did not solve the deeper issues of uneven coverage, high costs, and weather-related failures. London remained a city of contrasts, bright spots of regulated illumination alongside yawning expanses of darkness where the law's reach faltered. To walk its streets at night was to move constantly between light and shadow, between order and uncertainty. What these lamp laws reveal, above all, is the city's struggle with the problem of the night. Darkness was not merely an environmental condition. It was a frontier of governance, where law, technology, and custom collided. Every lantern hung outside a doorway represented both compliance and complaint, both the flicker of safety and the weight of obligation. And as the city expanded, so too did the question: could the law ever truly conquer the night, or would shadows always find a way to persist? The figure of the lamplighter became one of the most recognizable characters in 18th century London's nocturnal landscape. Long before gaslight and electricity, it was these men, often poorly paid, frequently overlooked, who walked the streets each evening with their long poles, climbing ladders, and small oil flasks. To see a lamplighter moving from one post to another, striking his flame to life within a glass-walled box, was to witness a nightly ritual, the city awakening into its artificial glow. Their duties were deceptively simple. Each lamplighter was assigned a route, often stretching through several streets or alleys, with a fixed number of lamps to tend. At dusk, he would set out carrying the equipment needed: a torch or smouldering wick to transfer flame, a trimming hook for wicks, and a flask of oil for replenishment. The work was repetitive, yet precise. A lamp that burned too weakly provided little safety, while one that flared too strongly might shatter its glass or burn out too quickly. Timing was equally important. Lamps were expected to be lit as darkness fell, extinguished at dawn, and maintained throughout the night should wind or rain interfere. In practice, this was not easy. London's weather was an enemy of flame. Wind rushed down narrow alleys, extinguishing lanterns almost as soon as they were lit. Rain seeped into housings not properly sealed, snuffing out the wicks. Dense fog, the infamous London pea souper, absorbed light, reducing even a well-tended lamp to a faint halo a few feet wide. Lamplighters sometimes found themselves retracing their routes 2 or 3 times a night, relighting what had already been put out. The conditions of their employment reflected the city's ambivalence toward them. Many were hired by private contractors who had secured lamp maintenance contracts from parishes or civic authorities. Wages were low and the hours unsocial, dusk to dawn, with little rest in all weather. Some lamplighters supplemented their income by taking other jobs during the day, labourers, porters, or street sellers, leaving them perpetually tired. Yet despite their humble standing, their work was indispensable. Without them, the city's legal commitment to illuminated streets would collapse into darkness. Lamplighters also faced hazards. Carrying flammable oil and open flame through crowded streets was dangerous enough, but more pressing were the threats from people. Mischief was common. Children and drunken men sometimes followed lamplighters, blowing out newly lit lamps for sport. Others threw stones at the glass boxes, shattering panes and forcing the lamplighter to replace them at his own expense. In rougher districts, lamplighters were sometimes assaulted outright. Their poles seized, their oil stolen, their work undone as quickly as it was performed. Despite this, the presence of a lamplighter was often reassuring. Residents saw them as moving beacons of order, men who brought small pockets of visibility to a treacherous city. To see a lamplighter at work meant that the neighbourhood was, at least briefly, cared for. In diaries and letters, Londoners occasionally mention the sound of lamplighters tapping their poles against cobblestones or ladder rungs, a background rhythm of city life that marked the transition from day to night. The job also carried a certain symbolism. Lamplighters were not officials of the law, but their work contributed directly to the enforcement of order. A lit street was less welcoming to thieves and more comfortable for respectable citizens moving between homes, taverns, or coffee houses. In this sense, lamplighters were quiet partners of watchmen and constables, extending their reach not through authority, but through visibility. Technological change slowly altered their role. Oil lamps improved in design, burning longer and more brightly, which reduced the need for constant tending. By the late 18th century, experiments with gaslight promised a future where lamps could be lit en masse from central sources, threatening to make the lamplighter obsolete. For decades, however, they remained essential figures, bridges between law, labor, and light. There was also an unintended social dimension to their work. Because lamplighters moved through nearly every neighborhood, they became keen observers of the city's rhythms. They noticed who lingered in alleys, which doors welcomed late-night visitors, and where disturbances were likely to occur. Some became informal informants, passing on observations to watchmen or parish officials. Others simply absorbed the city's secrets, silent witnesses to its nocturnal life. Still, lamplighters rarely received public gratitude. They were seen more as part of the scenery than as individuals, their presence acknowledged only when absent. A lamp left unlit sparked immediate complaint, while 100 kept glowing went unnoticed. Theirs was a thankless labor, visible only through its failures. Yet it was precisely in this invisibility that their importance lay. Without their daily routine, the very idea of a regulated, illuminated city could not survive. The figure of the lamplighter thus embodies London's uneasy attempt to control its nights, humble men carrying flames through damp, dangerous streets, tasked with maintaining an artificial order in a city that never fully bent to their efforts. And it raises a question: if the work of keeping light alive was so fragile, how much of the city's safety depended not on the lamps themselves, but on the endless human labor required to keep them burning? In the closing decades of the 18th century, the faint orange flicker of oil lamps along London streets began to face competition from an invention that promised brighter, steadier, and far less labor-intensive light gas illumination. The shift was gradual, but for those accustomed to the old world of lamplighters and parish lantern laws, It marked the beginning of an entirely new relationship with the night. The first experiments with gaslight in London were curiosities, confined to scientific demonstrations or private industrial spaces. Inventors had discovered that by burning coal gas, one could produce a light that was far more powerful than any oil flame. In the early 1800s, these experiments spread into public use. Factories and mills, eager to extend working hours, became early adopters. It was only a matter of time before the idea reached the city's streets. By 1807, Pall Mall became the first London thoroughfare to boast a full line of gas lamps. The difference was striking. Gone was the weak, sputtering glow of oil. In its place shone a steadier, whiter brilliance that cast shadows farther, illuminated more clearly, and required far fewer attendants. People gathered to marvel, some suspicious, others enthralled. The newspapers remarked that gaslight could transform the very fabric of urban life. The implications were immense. For centuries, the rhythm of London after dark had been tied to the limitations of oil and tallow. Lamplighters had trudged the streets every evening, and their absence meant darkness. But gaslight allowed entire networks of lamps to be lit from centralized valves, eliminating much of that labor. It also promised consistency. A gas flame could withstand weather more reliably than a fragile oil wick. The city's nights, long precarious, suddenly seemed more controllable. Yet this progress was not without resistance. Oil contractors, whose livelihoods depended on lamp maintenance, saw their business threatened. Lamplighters themselves faced redundancy, stripped of the role that had defined generations of nocturnal workers. Many protested, but technological change advanced relentlessly. The city, eager for efficiency and prestige, invested heavily in gas infrastructure. Within a few decades, thousands of gas lamps dotted London, and the lamplighter's profession dwindled into memory. For ordinary citizens, the effect was transformative. Streets, once avoided at night now, gleamed with new visibility. Shops extended their hours, theatres welcomed later crowds, and taverns flourished under brighter signs. But the shift also had deeper social consequences. Crime did not vanish, but the balance of risk shifted. Thieves and cutpurses found fewer hiding places, while watchmen gained an advantage in spotting mischief. Nighttime became more porous, less dominated by fear, more open to activity. Still, gaslight carried its own costs. Its production filled the air with acrid fumes. Its maintenance required networks of pipes, and its light, though revolutionary, was uneven at first. In some neighborhoods, residents complained that the glare disrupted sleep or altered the familiar rhythms of their streets. The glow of gaslight could be as intrusive as it was liberating, reshaping not only visibility but also perception of time itself. What had once been a city structured by natural cycles of day and night became increasingly artificial. People stayed out later, worked longer, and trusted in the permanence of light that never truly slept. The lantern laws of earlier centuries, once urgent measures to carve order out of darkness, were gradually forgotten. They belonged to a different London, one where safety depended on small flames carried by tired men through damp streets. In the long view, this shift from oil to gas was less about light itself and more about control. The city learned that technology could impose a new order upon the night, not by mandating the labor of hundreds of lamplighters, but by harnessing infrastructure, where once visibility relied on fragile wicks and human diligence. Now it flowed from centralized pipes, a triumph of engineering over routine. Yet one cannot help but wonder what was lost in the process. The lamplighter, with his slow, deliberate rounds, had been a visible reminder of the city's nightly struggle to keep darkness at bay. His work was humble, yet human, a rhythm of footsteps, poles, and flames that marked the passage of hours. Gaslight erased much of that, replacing ritual with automation. The city became brighter, safer perhaps, but also less personal. By the mid-19th century, London had embraced gaslight almost entirely, and the memory of lantern laws faded into obscurity. The lamplighters who once defined the night became figures of nostalgia, immortalized in prints, poems, and the occasional fond recollection. Their disappearance signaled not just a technological shift, but a cultural one. The night was no longer something fragile to be managed, but a domain steadily conquered by human invention. And so, the story of London's lantern laws and lamplighters closes with an irony. What began as a desperate attempt to make darkness survivable ended with the transformation of night into something altogether new, an illuminated frontier, extending commerce, leisure, and vigilance into hours once reserved for rest. But in gaining this mastery, London also gave up the small, flickering rituals that once connected its people to the uncertainties of night. It leaves us with a quiet question. When technology removes the need for human hands to keep light alive, do we also lose some sense of our shared fragility? That ancient bond of gathering close around the flame. In the drawing rooms of 18th century London, the gentle glow of candlelight carried meanings far beyond mere illumination. A flickering taper could signal welcome or dismissal, propriety or intimacy, depending on how and where it was placed. For young men and women, navigating the carefully guarded rituals of courtship, the candle became an unspoken guide, setting boundaries, hinting at intentions, and quietly structuring the tempo of an evening visit. Unlike the brightly lit theatres or the noisy taverns, evening calls in private homes operated within a dimmer, more fragile world. Wax was expensive, tallow less pleasant, and families rationed their candles carefully. To light too many was ostentatious, even vulgar. To light too few was miserly, even inhospitable. A parlour arranged with just the right balance, 2 or 3 candles on a mantel, perhaps one on a side table, created an atmosphere both respectable and inviting. In that delicate glow, words carried greater weight, gestures seemed more noticeable, and silence stretched into something meaningful. The rules of visiting were precise. A gentleman might call on a family in the early evening, never too late, always announced by a servant or a knock upon the door. He would be shown into the parlour, where the daughter of the house might sit with embroidery or music, her mother discreetly nearby. Candlelight softened features, blurred imperfections, and lent to every encounter a kind of theatrical staging. A suitor was meant to speak carefully, offer polite compliments, and avoid any remark that might seem too forward. Yet within these narrow boundaries, subtle signals abounded. A candle moved closer to the young lady's chair might suggest an intimacy approved by her mother. One snuffed early could indicate the evening was over. London itself framed these encounters with both opportunity and risk. Streets were lit unevenly, lanterns sputtering against the fog, and so the journey to and from a visit carried its own significance. A gentleman willing to cross the city at night displayed seriousness of intent. A family receiving him signaled trust. But once inside, the focus narrowed to the parlour, where candlelight became the measure of both time and propriety. There were no clocks dictating departure, only the length of a taper burning low. For young women, these visits offered rare chances to speak with men outside the formalities of assemblies or church. Yet they were always observed, their words noted, their behaviour judged. Mothers and aunts became guardians of reputation, their watchful presence illuminated in the same flickering light. The candle did not hide impropriety, rather, it heightened the sense that everything visible was subject to interpretation. To lean too close, to linger too long, to whisper rather than speak, each gesture became magnified in that fragile circle of light. But there was also a quiet intimacy in these evenings. Without the noise of crowds or the harsh brightness of day, the candle's glow invited reflection. A shared glance could stretch longer. A piece of music performed on the harpsichord could sound richer. And even small talk about weather or neighbours seemed infused with meaning. Many couples later remembered such evenings as the beginnings of attachment. Moments not marked by grand declarations, but by the careful, patient cultivation of trust. As London's nights changed with the coming of gaslight and longer hours of activity, these candlelit visits began to lose their central place. But in the 18th century, they were essential, forming the backbone of respectable courtship. Every taper burned not just wax, but possibility, its flame marking the slow, cautious path between formality and affection. And yet one wonders, in a world so carefully lit, how often did the shadows of candlelight hide feelings never spoken, affections restrained by ritual, or disappointments quietly endured? In those quiet parlours of 18th century London, what looked like a simple evening visit was in fact a finely tuned performance, choreographed by the family and observed by every servant who crossed the threshold. A knock at the door began a sequence of motions, the maid or footman announcing the caller, the drawing room prepared with just the right number of candles, and the hostess seated in a position that allowed her to both welcome and supervise. Courtship, though wrapped in civility, was rarely spontaneous. Families guarded their daughters' futures carefully, and every encounter carried weight. A gentleman's punctuality, his dress, even the way he removed his hat upon entering the parlour, all were taken as signs of character. If his boots showed dust, perhaps he had walked far, suggesting earnestness. If his coat smelled faintly of tobacco or spirits, whispers might follow once he departed. Reputation could be enhanced or undone by such small observations, and the candlelight made them all the more noticeable. Servants played roles often unspoken, but crucial. A maid might discreetly add or remove a candle, depending on the mood of the evening, at the direction of her mistress. A footman's timing in announcing the hour, or in bringing in refreshments, could either prolong a conversation or cut it short. Even a hallway cough, or the sound of footsteps nearby reminded visitors that privacy was limited, and that every word carried beyond the parlour doors. For young men and women attempting to balance politeness with the stirrings of affection, this constant awareness formed the unchanging backdrop. The social codes governing these visits were taught through repetition. A gentleman who overstayed might find himself unwelcome the following week. A young woman too talkative or too reserved risked damaging her prospects. Parents weighed suitors not just by wealth or lineage, but by their ability to navigate these quiet evenings with grace. To show respect for the candlelight was to show respect for the household economy. It meant understanding thrift, modesty, and discipline. Wasteful burning of wax could mark a man as careless. Offering to replace a taper, however, might be seen as forward or presumptuous. It is in this balance that strategy emerged. A father might allow visits from several young men, subtly measuring how each carried himself under the soft scrutiny of a dim parlour. A mother, by asking her daughter to play music or read aloud by candlelight, created a stage where suitors could react. Did they listen attentively? Did they praise appropriately? Did they attempt conversation at the right intervals? Even silence mattered. A suitor who let the room lapse into awkwardness too often risked exclusion. Behind the formalities lay the constant pressure of community reputation. Neighbours noted who called on whom, how frequently, and how late the lights burned in a household. Gossip might spread if a gentleman was seen leaving past the expected hour, or if a family seemed too eager to host a particular visitor. To be respectable meant ensuring that courtship remained public enough to guard against suspicion, yet private enough to allow genuine conversation. Candlelight, again, provided the perfect medium. It revealed just enough, while leaving intentions and emotions in partial shadow. The city outside reinforced these rhythms. Church bells, the calls of watchmen, or the striking of the hour by nearby clocks marked the limits of evening visits. To ignore these cues was to risk impropriety. Families expected suitors to depart before midnight, lest whispers of impropriety begin. Yet within that time, 1,000 silent judgments were made, a glance exchanged, a hand momentarily brushed while passing a music sheet, or a compliment framed within the politeness of the hour. For some, these visits ended in promising futures, marriages arranged, fortunes aligned, and households joined. For others, they ended quietly, a taper snuffed, a door politely closed, and the matter never raised again. The ritual was repetitive, perhaps tedious to those involved, yet its repetition gave it strength. It allowed families to measure character not by one bold gesture, but by consistency, by how a young man returned week after week, his behaviour steady, his attentions proper. And still, within all this order, there were exceptions. Servants whispered of suitors who pressed too boldly, of families who ignored conventions, of young people who found ways to bend the candlelit hours toward their own desires. These stories, though less frequently told, remind us that beneath every system of rules lies human nature, testing the edges of what is allowed. But one cannot help but wonder, when the candlelight dimmed, and a suitor walked away into the fog of London's night. How often did both families and lovers reconsider? Had the evening revealed too much, or not enough? The final chapter of these evening visits lies not just in the individual romances they produced, but in the broader changes that reshaped London's rhythms of courtship. By the dawn of the 19th century, the soft glow of candlelight in parlours was slowly yielding to new sources of light, new ideas of sociability, and new pressures from an expanding city. What had once been a ritual bound by tapers and silence was now entering a different stage of urban life. The introduction of gaslight into London's streets, beginning in the early 1800s, altered the meaning of nighttime itself. Where once families had relied on candles to frame the length and intimacy of a visit, gas lamps outside extended the hours of activity. A suitor could now walk more safely home, reducing the urgency to leave before midnight. Neighbours could see more clearly who entered and exited a household. What was once hidden in the protective shadow of candlelit streets became visible under the steady glow of public lighting. The secrecy that evening visits sometimes afforded began to slip away. Within households, too, the economy of light shifted. Candles, once guarded and rationed, no longer carried the same symbolic weight. Gaslight, when installed, freed families from the careful staging of visits that wax had required. This did not erase the rituals of courtship, but it changed their tone. A brightly lit drawing room did not invite quite the same intimacy as the gentle flicker of a taper. Parents who had once managed encounters by adjusting candles now found themselves playing host under the steadier conditions of new illumination. Something quiet and slow was lost, though perhaps few remarked upon it directly. At the same time, shifting social expectations complicated the meaning of these visits. The rise of newspapers and coffeehouse culture gave Londoners new spaces for interaction, while the growing wealth of the middle classes allowed some families to expand their social reach beyond tightly controlled parlour gatherings. Young people began to meet not only in drawing rooms, but at assemblies, public gardens, and organised dances. Parlour visit by candlelight, though still common, no longer stood as the sole stage for polite courtship, yet the echoes of that older ritual endured. Even in the age of gaslight, parents maintained their vigilance, insisting on formal introductions, supervised meetings, and careful observation of character. The lessons of the candlelit era, the importance of punctuality, the balance of conversation, the scrutiny of manners, continued to shape expectations. A young man's steadiness, measured once by his consistent weekly visits, was still valued, even if the glow around him came from gas jets rather than wax tapers. For those who remembered the old ways, nostalgia sometimes coloured their reflections. Letters and diaries recall evenings where a single candle illuminated a book of music, where silence carried more weight than speech, and where the soft extinguishing of a taper marked both an ending and a promise. The gradual disappearance of such moments reflects more than just technological change. It signals a broader transformation in how intimacy, reputation, and community were balanced in London life. As the city grew, so too did its distractions. The quiet parlour, once the primary site of romantic negotiation, competed with theatres, promenades, and public entertainments. Privacy, paradoxically, became harder to find amid the bustle, and the candlelit visit, with all its limitations, seemed in retrospect to have offered a kind of controlled intimacy that later generations missed. To sit together in a dim room, knowing that each word was measured, each gesture observed, may have seemed restrictive at the time, yet it created a framework of discipline that shaped entire generations of marriages and households. And so, the history of these evening visits is both ordinary and profound. Ordinary because they were repeated countless times across countless households, in ways so uniform they might seem dull. Profound because within their repetition lay the foundations of family alliances, the shaping of reputations, and the quiet endurance of social order. 1,000 flickering candles bore witness to conversations that decided futures, not by dramatic declaration, but by steady observation. When we think of London in the 18th century, it is easy to picture its grand buildings, its noisy markets, or its crowded taverns. Yet the city was equally defined by its quietest rooms, where young men and women sat across from each other under the watchful eyes of family and servants, speaking carefully, saying just enough, waiting for time to reveal whether the flicker of a candlelight evening would lead to a lasting union. And so, one last question lingers in the age of electricity. When the night no longer relies on flame and shadow, what have we lost of that slower, quieter rhythm? The ritual of waiting, of watching, of letting futures unfold by the light of a single taper. The clatter of wooden pails against stone steps was once as familiar in London as the tolling of church bells. Long before the comfort of a faucet or the gurgle of a pump inside the home, water was not something most Londoners could command at will. It had to be fetched, carried, and delivered, often by men whose entire lives were spent balancing sloshing buckets on yokes across their shoulders. These water carriers, sometimes called cobs, porters, or simply drawers, moved quietly through the city streets, weaving between carriages, children, and the odd herd of livestock that still occupied the lanes. Their trade was humble, exhausting, and rarely celebrated, but without them, daily life in the city would have ground to a halt. The streets of London in the 17th and 18th centuries did not hum with the constant flow of clean water pipes. Instead, the metropolis relied on a patchwork system of conduits, wells, and private supplies, many of them inadequate to serve a population that was swelling by the year. A wealthy household might subscribe to a private conduit, a pipe system leading water directly from a spring or river to a cistern near the home. But even these were unreliable. Droughts reduced supply, pipes leaked, and reservoirs ran dry. For ordinary people, tradesmen, apprentices, widows, or small shopkeepers, there was little choice but to buy water by the pail, carried in by human hands. The carriers were distinctive figures in the city's landscape. They wore rough coats, sometimes leather aprons to keep off the splashes, and balanced a wooden yoke across their shoulders. From each end hung a stout pail, made of oak bound with iron hoops. The weight was considerable. A full pail might weigh 50 pounds, and most carriers bore 2 at a time. They developed a rolling gait, a slow, steady shuffle that minimized spillage while conserving energy. The rhythm of their steps, punctuated by the occasional slop of water over the rim, was a quiet soundtrack to the daily routine of a city where tens of thousands relied on their labor. It is tempting to imagine the trade as simple: fill the buckets, deliver them, collect the pennies. But in reality it was a precarious economy shaped by geography, regulation, and competition. Water carriers did not simply wander about, choosing their customers freely. They were often tied to a specific conduit, or well, with rights and permissions managed by guilds or overseers. Some carriers paid small fees to secure the privilege of drawing water from a particular source, while others were employed directly by conduit keepers who leased them out. The profits were thin, and many carriers lived hand to mouth, their earnings barely enough to cover rent and bread. The physical strain was unrelenting. A carrier might climb narrow staircases to upper, floor rooms, shifting the yoke carefully so as not to tip the load. He might trudge half a mile from the conduit to the customer's dwelling, repeating the trip dozens of times a day. The job demanded endurance and strength, but also caution. Spilling too much reduced one's income, and slipping on London's filth, slick cobbles could mean injury or worse. It was a profession of constant bodily negotiation with the weight of necessity. And yet, for all the hardship, water carriers were trusted figures. They entered homes daily, often more intimately than other tradesmen. A baker might sell you a loaf at the shop, but the water carrier came to your kitchen or yard, stamping the mud from his boots before setting down his pails. In poorer neighborhoods, he might leave water in shared barrels, measuring out smaller amounts for families who could not afford a full load. The rhythm of his visits marked the passing of hours. Morning water for washing and cooking, mid-day deliveries for brewing ale, evening trips for cleaning and refilling cisterns. His schedule intertwined with the city's domestic pulse. Londoners noticed when carriers failed to appear. A missed delivery could mean unwashed hands before supper, no boiling water for tea, or dry basins at bedtime. Even the modest rituals of cleanliness and comfort hinged on the steady arrival of men who were almost invisible in the city's chronicles. They left few letters, no celebrated memoirs, and only the occasional line in a court record when a dispute or accident drew official attention. Yet without them, London's vast social machine could not have functioned. What makes their story all the more compelling is how it intersected with broader urban anxieties. Water was not simply a matter of convenience, it was a matter of health and morality. Contaminated supplies spread disease. Stagnant barrels bred foul smells. Authorities fretted over cleanliness, though they rarely provided adequate public infrastructure to guarantee it. Into this gap stepped the carriers, men whose backs bore not only the weight of pails, but the burden of an entire city's hygiene. As London grew, so too did tensions. The demand for water outpaced the available conduits, especially in dry summers. Carriers might find themselves waiting in long lines at public spouts, competing with each other for access. Quarrels broke out, buckets clashed, and tempers flared. Sometimes fights escalated into full brawls, with yokes wielded like clubs. Regulations attempted to impose order, dictating hours of access and rates of payment, but enforcement was inconsistent. It was a system as leaky as the pipes themselves. Despite their lowly status, carriers were keenly aware of their importance. They organized in small groups, occasionally petitioning city officials for better rights or protection from exploitation. Some carved out profitable niches, securing steady contracts with taverns, breweries, or large households. A carrier serving a prosperous inn might earn more than one trudging between poor tenements, but for most, the work was relentless drudgery, a cycle of lifting, walking, and pouring that stretched from dawn until dusk. Even the tools of their trade had histories of their own. The pails were made by coopers, the same craftsmen who built barrels for beer and wine. The yokes varied in design, some plain wood, others padded with cloth to soften the bite into shoulders. A well-balanced yoke was prized, and carriers often adjusted theirs carefully, sanding the wood smooth or binding it with leather strips. In an era before mass production, every tool carried the marks of individual hands, linking one set of laborers to another in the city's hidden economy. From the perspective of modern convenience, it is easy to underestimate the significance of such work. Yet imagine for a moment trying to run a household without taps, pumps, or plumbing. Every pot of tea, every wash basin, every boiling pot of broth depended on someone else's wary footsteps. The next time you turned on a faucet, you might have thought of the man outside in the rain, trudging with his buckets. And so, the hidden economy of water carriers threaded itself quietly into London's fabric. The city's elegance, its coffee houses, its bustling markets, its gatherings of scholars and merchants, was underpinned by the sweat of men who remained largely nameless. Their trade carried no prestige, but it carried life itself. Yet, as with all such professions, change was on the horizon. New technologies, new companies, and new ideas about civic infrastructure would soon challenge the carrier's place in the city. The pipes beneath the streets began to grow in number, rivaling the human footsteps above. But in the years before such transformations, the carrier's yoke remained one of London's most familiar sights. Still, one wonders, when pipes finally began to snake their way under the cobbles, bringing water with the twist of a tap, what became of the men whose livelihoods had depended on the weight of wooden pails? Did they find other work, or did they fade quietly from the city's rhythm, as unnoticed in departure as they had been in daily toil? The decline of London's water carriers was not sudden, but it unfolded steadily across the 18th and early 19th centuries, as if the city itself were shifting beneath their feet. For generations, they had been indispensable, but London was never a city to remain still. Its population grew, its needs multiplied, and its technologies crept forward. The quiet men with yokes and buckets began to face rivals who were not flesh and blood, but iron and timber, pipes, pumps, and companies that sought to control the flow of water not by muscle, but by engineering. At the start of the 18th century, the old system of conduits still dominated. These stone and lead pipes, some dating back to medieval times, carried spring water from the countryside into the city. They ended at public conduits, essentially large fountains or cisterns where water carriers filled their pails. London had perhaps a dozen main conduits, each a source of daily traffic. But as the city expanded, these conduits could no longer keep up. Waiting times lengthened. Carriers jostled for position. Those who could afford it sought alternatives. Into this market stepped the private water companies. The most notable of these was the New River Company, founded in 1619, which channeled fresh water from Hertfordshire into the city through an artificial river and a network of wooden pipes. By the 1700s, the company had grown into a formidable presence. It leased connections directly to households, running lead pipes into homes and charging annual fees. Wealthier Londoners eagerly subscribed. Why pay a carrier daily when one could draw water from a tap in one's own courtyard? The carriers saw their trade shrinking, but for many years they remained essential. Not every household could afford a subscription, and the company's pipes reached only certain districts. For large swaths of the population, artisans, apprentices, widows, the old system persisted. Carriers filled the gap, hauling water to those beyond the reach of pipes. But the balance had shifted. For the first time, carriers were no longer the sole lifeline. They were competitors in a changing marketplace. As pipes spread, new disputes arose. Carriers complained that companies monopolized sources and restricted access to conduits. They petitioned city authorities, arguing that ordinary people still depended on them. Sometimes they found sympathy, but often the companies prevailed. The carriers were fragmented, each man an individual laborer with little power against organized corporations. Where once they had stood in noisy clusters at the conduit, now they found themselves isolated, their work increasingly confined to poorer neighborhoods. Yet decline was not uniform. Certain niches still provided steady work. Breweries and taverns remained heavy consumers of water, and some preferred human carriers to unreliable pipes. Firefighting brigades also drew on carriers who could supply barrels of water at a blaze more quickly than distant companies. Even in wealthier homes, pipes were not always trustworthy. Leaks, blockages, and contamination plagued the system. Carriers sometimes stepped in to supplement a failing connection, their yokes a backup plan against technological failure. But the writing was on the wall, or more accurately, under the ground. By the late 18th century, London hosted not one, but several competing water companies, each laying pipes into new districts. The Lambeth Waterworks, the Chelsea Waterworks, and others joined the New River Company in carving up the metropolis. Together, they created a patchwork of supply zones. For the carriers, this was devastating. Areas once serviced entirely by bucket now shifted to pipes, and customers who once greeted the carrier daily now locked their gates, their water arriving silently beneath their feet. The carriers adapted as best they could. Some shifted trades, turning to other forms of manual labor. Others specialized, seeking work in districts still underserved. A few attempted to formalize their services, organizing small groups that promised regular delivery at fixed rates. But the economic tide was against them. The city's appetite for modern infrastructure could not be slowed by tradition. The carriers' decline was not merely economic, it was cultural. In earlier generations, they had been familiar, even trusted figures. Children grew up seeing the same carrier bring water to their door, his gait and his yoke as recognizable as the neighborhood baker. But as pipes spread, that relationship disappeared. Water became anonymous, delivered not by a man with muddy boots, but by a hidden network of wood and lead. The intimacy of daily exchange gave way to the abstraction of a bill paid once a year. For those who remained in the trade, the work grew harder. As wealthier customers turned to pipes, the carriers were left serving the poorest households. Families who often could pay only sporadically, if at all. A carrier might deliver pails to a widow's tenement, only to be told she had no coins that week. He could hardly refuse, for water was a necessity, but unpaid labor wore down his livelihood. Increasingly, carriers were forced into desperate bargaining, taking on debts themselves just to survive. By the early 19th century, the image of the carrier had become almost a relic. Satirists and pamphleteers mocked them as old-fashioned figures of a bygone era. To the new middle classes, with their taps and cisterns, Carriers seemed symbols of the city's backwardness, yet in poorer quarters, Clerkenwell, Southwark, Whitechapel, they lingered, their footsteps echoing down alleys long after they had vanished elsewhere. Even then, they played a role in the city's hidden economy. In slums and courts where pipes did not reach, carriers were still essential. Their pails supplied the water that mothers boiled for porridge, that laundresses scrubbed with, that apprentices used to doze the sweat of a day's labour. They were ghosts of an older London, surviving on the margins, sustaining lives quietly even as the city forgot them. And in their decline lies a paradox. For centuries, water carriers were invisible precisely because they were essential. No one celebrated them when they were needed. And when their work vanished, no one mourned them either. They slipped out of history as silently as they had lived within it, leaving behind only faint traces, mentions in city records, scattered petitions, and the occasional sketch or anecdote. What endures, however, is their reminder of how fragile daily life once was. The comfort of turning a tap today rests on centuries of effort, invention, and, before that, on the unrelenting footsteps of men with wooden yokes. The carrier's labour may be forgotten, but every drop of water that passed through their hands was a thread in London's survival. Their memory lingers faintly, not in monuments or statues, but in scraps of cultural residue, songs, prints, and curious mentions in dusty archives. Water carriers never occupied the grand stage of London's history. They were too ordinary, too fleeting. And yet, like the faint watermark left on paper, their presence can still be discerned if one knows where to look. Ballads from the 17th and 18th centuries occasionally reference the honest water-bearer, a figure both comic and pitiable. Street hawkers often made their way into popular songs, and carriers were no exception. In some verses they were portrayed as cheerful labourers, clinking their buckets down cobbled lanes. In others, they were mocked as rustic figures, sweating and splashing, their very toil an object of urban amusement. Like so many tradesmen of old London, they existed in the popular imagination not as individuals but as types, background characters in the theatre of city life. Printmakers, too, found them useful subjects. In satirical engravings of London's bustling streets, one can often spot a stooped figure with a yoke crossing the scene. They are never central, never heroic, but they are there, reminders of the labour that kept the city functioning. In some caricatures, carriers are shown stumbling, spilling their load to the laughter of onlookers. In others, they trudge past elegant ladies and powdered gentlemen, a contrast between the sweat of necessity and the leisure of wealth. The carrier's presence helped define the city's social contrasts, though rarely with sympathy. Official records tell a quieter story. Petitions to the city council survive, in which groups of carriers pleaded for fair access to conduits, or complained about the encroachments of water companies. These documents reveal a collective voice, though rarely a victorious one. The petitions are polite but urgent, full of appeals to tradition and necessity. They remind us that the carriers were not simply individuals with buckets, but a fragile community bound together by shared struggle. By the 19th century, the image of the carrier had become tinged with nostalgia. Writers describing old London often included a passing reference to them, alongside Watchmen, link boys, and other vanished trades. These accounts paint the carriers as quaint relics of a rougher, but somehow more human city, a time when one's water was delivered by a known figure, not an impersonal company. Yet this nostalgia was selective, forgetting the back-breaking reality of their work. It was easier to romanticize the carrier once he no longer existed. Still, their traces endure in subtle ways. Some London place names and local expressions hark back to the trade, though their origins are often forgotten. A lane near an old conduit might still carry a name referencing wells or pails. A proverb might echo their labours, preserved by habit long after the meaning has faded. The city itself, with its layers of memory, rarely erases completely. Instead, it buries, leaving fragments for later generations to rediscover. In the end, the carrier's disappearance marked more than just the vanishing of a profession. It signalled a shift in how Londoners experienced one of life's most basic resources. Water, once a daily encounter with a human figure at the threshold, became something hidden, silent, and assumed. The relationship between household and laborer dissolved, replaced by the abstraction of infrastructure. Where once a knock at the door brought buckets of fresh water, now a bill arrived by post. That shift was part of London's broader transformation into a modern metropolis. A place where personal exchange gave way to systems, where the intimate labor of survival was replaced by invisible networks. The water carriers, humble as they were, embody that transition. They remind us that the conveniences of modern life rest on forgotten backs, and that progress often erases its own foundations. For those who study the city, their memory is a gift. It encourages us to see London not only as a place of great events and grand figures, but also as a web of small labours. The water carrier, trudging under his yoke, belongs to that vast company of forgotten workers without whom the city could not have endured. His story, though faint, carries the weight of countless footsteps echoing down long, vanished lanes. And so the tale of London's water carriers concludes, not with drama, but with quiet disappearance, much like their daily rounds, steady and unremarked, until the world changed around them. To remember them now is to pause and hear, in imagination, the creak of the yoke and the slosh of the pail, a rhythm that once kept an entire city alive. In the cramped back alleys and shadowed courtyards of London, long before the city became the polished capital of empire, another class of worker moved with quiet purpose. These were the rat catchers, men whose lives were bound up in the endless scurrying of vermin beneath floorboards, in cellars, and along the dripping stones of the city's sewers. By the 18th and 19th centuries, their occupation had become almost indispensable. London was a city of rapid growth, a metropolis where refuse piled high and food scraps lay scattered in markets, taverns, and homes. The rats thrived. For the ordinary resident, whether a wealthy merchant or a poor charwoman, the presence of rats was a nuisance at best, a danger at worst. For the rat catcher, it was a livelihood, grim and steady. You can picture him now, a figure moving down a cobbled lane in the half-light, carrying a sack slung over one shoulder, its contents shifting faintly with the scratching of trapped animals. At his belt, he might keep a small net or a stick tipped with a crude hook, tools designed to reach into holes or drag out a reluctant rodent. Some carried small dogs, wiry terriers bred for quickness and ferocity, capable of darting into dark corners where a man's hand could not safely reach. Others relied on ferrets, nimble creatures that could be sent into burrows or crevices, flushed out prey, and returned sleekly with a flick of their tails. It was an odd partnership of man and animal, each dependent on the other, in the peculiar business of vermin control. Rat catchers rarely occupied a place of honor in society. Their trade was seen as dirty, both literally and morally. They worked with creatures associated with filth, disease, and the underworld of the city. Yet paradoxically, they were also tolerated and even necessary. The problem of rats was so persistent that someone had to deal with it, and the catchers, despite their shabby coats and rough manners, provided a service no one else wished to perform. They might be called discreetly to an affluent household, entering through the back door to clear a kitchen of infestation before polite guests arrived. They might work openly in taverns, demonstrating their skills by releasing a captured rat into a small enclosure and letting their dog dispatch it in moments, proof that they were effective men worth hiring. Their reputation depended less on refinement than on results. The economy of rat catching was never glamorous, but it could be steady. Some catchers were employed directly by estates, breweries, or warehouses where grain and foodstuffs were stored in abundance. Others roamed freely, taking jobs where they could, charging by the head or by the job. A skilled catcher might command surprising sums if he built a reputation for thoroughness. The most successful even found themselves entangled in London's peculiar entertainments. Rat baiting, a bloody pastime in which captured rodents were pitted against terriers for the amusement of spectators, gave some catchers an additional market. They supplied not just removal services, but the raw materials for sport. Here, the line between work and entertainment blurred, and while genteel society frowned at such spectacles, They drew eager crowds in backrooms and cellars across the city. The rat catcher's knowledge was practical and instinctive. He knew where to look in the damp corners of breweries, beneath the wooden planks of docks, in the kitchens of inns where scraps fell unnoticed. He recognized the faint gnaw marks on a sack of grain, the oily sheen of fur rubbed against a narrow passage, the sharp scent of ammonia marking a rat's territory. He understood their habits, that they moved along walls, that they were cautious in new environments, that they might be lured by bait, but never entirely fooled by traps. In this, he was a kind of naturalist of the underclass, cataloguing without writing, learning through repetition, through long nights of crouching by candlelight, and listening for the faintest rustle. Yet, for all their skill, rat catchers were not invulnerable. The diseases carried by rats, most notoriously plague, but also fevers and infections of all kinds, posed constant risks. Few would have framed their dangers in the language of germs, for germ theory was a later development, but there was a general recognition that close contact with vermin was unhealthy. Many rat catchers bore the scars of bites on their hands, or suffered illnesses attributed vaguely to bad air or poisons. Still, necessity kept them at their trade. In the precarious balance of urban survival, the certainty of a few shillings for catching rats outweighed the uncertain fear of what those rats might bring. What made their existence most peculiar, perhaps, was how invisible it was. Rat catchers operated largely at night, or at the edges of respectable life. Their work was acknowledged only when a problem became intolerable. Otherwise, their presence faded into the backdrop of the city, as unremarkable as chimney sweeps or night soil men. Yet without them, the delicate fabric of urban living might easily fray. Grain shipments spoiled, taverns overrun, homes made unbearable. The rat catcher's trade, though uncelebrated, was one of the quiet threads binding the daily life of London together. Imagine now, the city asleep, save for the rattle of a cart on distant stones. A watchman's lantern sways faintly at the corner, but beyond his circle of light, a smaller drama unfolds. A man stoops by a cellar grating, slipping a ferret into the gap. He waits, listening, until a squeal confirms the catch. With practiced motion, he secures the animal, drops it into his sack, and moves on. His work will continue until dawn, his sack filling slowly with the restless, unseen population of the city. When the sun rises, he will fade back into the alleys, a figure as elusive as the creatures he hunts. And so you are left to wonder, in a city that relied so heavily on its hidden labourers, what did it mean to live in a profession that was at once despised, tolerated, and utterly indispensable? The tavern cellars of London in the early 19th century were not only places of old barrels and smoke, thick gatherings. Some of them held another kind of entertainment, one that lurked in the shadows of legality and morality, the rat pits. Here, the work of rat catchers took on a second, less utilitarian form. They were not merely exterminators but suppliers of sport. By day, they rid kitchens and warehouses of infestations. By night, they delivered sacks of living cargo to tavern keepers eager to host bouts of rat baiting. It was a peculiar transformation of vermin from nuisance to spectacle, and in this world the rat catcher was both tradesman and showman. The practice was simple, if grim. A pit was constructed, often just a sunken ring in a cellar floor, sometimes lined with wood, sometimes with stone. Into this enclosure, the catcher would release a number of live rats. The spectators, clustered above with mugs in hand, would cheer as a dog, most often a terrier, was set against them. Bets were laid on how quickly the dog could kill a certain number, or on the dog's stamina against wave after wave of rodents. The rat catcher's role in these events was both practical and theatrical. He ensured the supply, counted out the animals, and sometimes even stirred the crowd with boasts of the quality of his catch, fierce, quick, not the sluggish sort one found in already starving alleys. To us, the idea may seem unsettling, but in its time it was not considered so different from cockfighting or bear baiting, pastimes which had long entertained the rougher corners of English society. The rat pits were smaller, perhaps more secretive, but they thrived for decades. And at their heart were the rat catchers, whose knowledge of vermin habits allowed them to produce a steady stream of contestants. Ironically, the very skill that made them useful to households and warehouses also made them valuable to taverns and gamblers. A rat catcher who could keep his animals alive, transport them without escape, and deliver them in numbers was as respected in this shadow world as a brewer with fine ale. The curious twist is that some rat catchers began breeding their quarry. Rather than relying solely on the chance of nightly hunts, they maintained cages or pens where rats multiplied. It was, in a sense, early animal husbandry applied to vermin, an industry within an industry. These captive colonies ensured a steady supply not only for sport, but also for demonstrations. There were public health displays, for instance, where catchers would show townsfolk how easily rats gnawed through wood or spread through a structure. The same creatures that represented filth became living teaching tools, even curiosities. Some rat catchers carried them in small wooden boxes, parading them in markets, turning vermin into objects of fascination. But not all aspects of this world were rough amusement. Behind the entertainment lay an undercurrent of danger. Rats were unpredictable when handled in large numbers. They could turn on one another or on the humans who managed them. A bite could fester, leading to weeks of swelling and fever. Catchers often bore scars on their hands, reminders of close calls. Some wore gloves of thick leather, though these hampered the dexterity needed to reach quickly into a sack or box. Others relied on sheer practice and speed, confident in their ability to grab a tail and fling the animal into place before it could twist and bite. It was a kind of physical craft, honed over long hours, every movement calculated to balance risk with efficiency. Despite their lowly reputation, a handful of rat catchers achieved a curious kind of fame. Charles Dickens, ever fascinated with the corners of London life, immortalized them in sketches and passing references. Newspapers occasionally reported on remarkable feats in the pits, celebrating dogs that dispatched dozens of rats in mere minutes. Behind each of these tales stood the catchers, anonymous suppliers of the spectacle. They lived in the blurred margins between necessity and vice, neither fully criminal nor fully respectable, but always present wherever Londoners sought either cleanliness or entertainment. And all the while, the city above them carried on. Respectable families dined in parlours lit by gaslight. Clerks hurried along Fleet Street with sheaves of paper. Dock workers hauled crates at the river. Beneath it all, in cellars and back rooms, the rat catcher counted out his stock, tightened the cord on his sack, and waited for the signal to release. The cheer of the crowd, the bark of a terrier, the thud of a rat against wooden boards, all of it was part of the strange rhythm of London life, a rhythm in which vermin and man were bound together by economy, by entertainment, and by the sheer persistence of survival. Yet one cannot help but imagine how the rat catcher himself felt at the end of such a night. Did he take pride in the skill of his animals, in the attention of the crowd, or did he slip home quietly, worried by the double life of necessary worker and purveyor of spectacle? His was a trade filled with contradictions, at once despised and relied upon, condemned and celebrated. In his small room, perhaps lit by a single candle, he would count his coins and tend to the few ferrets or dogs that shared his space, preparing for another day where the city's endless war against vermin gave him purpose. The industrial century brought with it a tide of change that swept away many of London's older trades, and among these was the curious figure of the rat catcher. As factories multiplied and railways carved their way through the city, the work of vermin control shifted from the hands of solitary catchers with their dogs and ferrets to more organized, regulated practices. What had once been a calling passed from father to son, or learned through apprenticeship on the streets, began to look more like a profession governed by public health officers and municipal rules. The rat catcher, in his patched coat and with his sack slung over his shoulder, found his world narrowing as science and sanitation grew in influence. The 19th century was the age of cholera and typhoid, and London, with its teeming population and endless maze of tenements, was particularly vulnerable. Rats, long considered a nuisance, became symbols of danger in a new, more alarming way. Physicians and reformers argued that controlling vermin was not simply a matter of convenience for households, but a crucial step in preventing outbreaks. Suddenly, rat catching was discussed not as a quaint or grimy trade, but as a cornerstone of public health. Yet this shift did not benefit the old independent catchers. Instead, it led to new authorities taking charge: inspectors, boards of health, and eventually whole departments devoted to sanitation. The change was as much about method as about status. Where once a man with a ferret could clear a granary, now there were chemical powders, poisons, and traps mass produced for sale. Advertisements appeared in newspapers boasting of surefire remedies for household vermin, reducing the need for a visit from the catcher at all. The sack of writhing animals and the practiced grab of a tail gave way to baited boxes and tins of phosphorus. It was progress, certainly, but it also marked the fading of a figure who had been both visible and oddly theatrical in the daily life of London. Industrialization did more than introduce new tools, it altered the very spaces where rats lived. The spread of sewers, a marvel of Victorian engineering, created a hidden underworld where the rodents flourished out of sight. Gone were the days when an entire warehouse would call upon a catcher to chase rats from the beams. Instead, infestations became a problem to be solved with traps in hidden corners or municipal campaigns that targeted whole districts. The lone catcher, once a familiar caller at kitchen doors, was increasingly sidelined. His craft, tied to the immediacy of dogs, ferrets, and personal daring, was less effective against the vast hidden colonies beneath the city. Still, some adapted. A few savvy catchers rebranded themselves as rat specialists, adopting poisons and traps alongside their traditional skills. Others leaned into the world of exhibition, capitalizing on the lingering fascination with vermin. Rat baiting itself was outlawed by mid-century, but rat shows and demonstrations, often marketed as educational, continued to draw curious crowds. Children peered at glass cages of scurrying animals, while reformers used them as evidence of urban neglect. The rat catcher, in this new guise, became part performer, part lecturer, displaying what had once been hidden as a way of sustaining his livelihood. But for many, the trade dwindled quietly. By the late 19th century, municipal officers were tasked with counting rat tails as proof of extermination, turning the business into a bureaucratic exercise rather than a personal one. The rough individuality of the old catcher was swallowed by record books and official reports. And as London modernized, with paved streets, gas lights, and public health campaigns, the figure of the catcher with his terrier became a relic of an earlier city, remembered more in anecdote and literature than in practice. Yet their memory lingers in small ways. In the margins of Dickens's works, in the tales of Victorian taverns, in the faint recollections of families who recalled the rat man visiting kitchens and barns. They embodied a particular kind of urban resilience, the knack of finding purpose in the city's endless problems, and of surviving by filling the gaps between necessity and entertainment. And so, as the century closed and London strode into the modern era, the rat catcher faded from its daily life, leaving behind only scraps of story. The sack, the ferret, the quick hands scarred by bites, all these belonged to a world where survival depended on improvisation and where vermin, despised yet endlessly present, gave shape to a peculiar livelihood. In the end, the rat catcher's tale is less about vermin than about the city itself, a place forever growing, forever changing, and forever creating space, however temporary, for those who could make a trade from its shadows.